Hi everyone. If you're new, welcome aboard. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Let me know in the comments. Now relax and enjoy the stories. At this time of year, there's no better way to pair too much food and alcohol than with chilling, dark tales of murder and mayhem. One such gruesome story takes place on Christmas Day, 1929, on a farm just outside Germantown, North Carolina. Charlie Lawson's big Christmas surprise for his family of 9 began with a trip to town. Determined to make it a special holiday, Charlie Lawson spared no expense, buying each family member an outfit of their choice before taking them to a local photographer for a family portrait. This was no small feat for a modest tobacco farmer. Just over a week later, it was Christmas Day, 1929. One might think that Charlie was a loving father trying to give his family a memorable Christmas despite his humble means, but that would be a false impression. On Christmas morning, 17-year-old Marie Lawson was busy in the kitchen preparing a fruitcake for the evening's dinner, while her younger sisters, 12-year-old Carrie and 7-year-old Mabel, wandered off to their aunt and uncle's house to celebrate and relieve some of the pressure on their parents. Charlie's wife, Fanny, who had been married to him for 17 years, was tending to their younger children, while Charlie and his oldest son, 16-year-old Arthur, known as Buck, had planned their annual Christmas hunting trip together. As they prepared for their outing, Charlie and Arthur realized they needed more shotgun shells for a successful hunt. Charlie sent Arthur to the store to pick some up, while Charlie waited in the tobacco barn. But when Charlie saw his 2 young daughters, Carrie and Mabel, returning from their aunt and uncle's house, he lifted his shotgun and aimed it at them. He pulled the trigger, and there's no way to describe the utter terror and confusion those poor girls must have felt in that moment. Charlie then made his way to the family home, still holding the gun tightly. Fanny, who had stepped onto the porch to investigate the gunshots, tried to flee, but it was no use. She couldn't outrun the blast. Marie, hearing the shots from inside, screamed in terror, only to be met with her father racking the weapon and shooting her down in the kitchen. The youngest children, hearing the chaos, tried to hide in fear for their lives. But Charlie found them quickly and savagely bludgeoned them to death with the butt of his shotgun. For reasons unknown, he then placed rocks beneath the heads of his dead wife and children and wandered into the woods, as if in a trance. Concerned neighbors, who had initially come by to wish the family a Merry Christmas, heard the gunfire and rushed to check on them. What they found was not a festive celebration, but a horrific scene of blood, buckshot, and shattered bone. Before they could go after Charlie, they heard a single gunshot coming from the woods. Charlie had taken his own life. By the time Arthur made it back from his trip into town, his entire family had been murdered. Folks at the town's general store had gotten word that something awful had happened, and someone in the town offered to give Arthur a ride back to the family farm. When he reached his home, the police had already arrived and a crowd began to gather. In the woods, police found footprints indicating that Charlie had been pacing around a tree for some time before taking his life. Next to his body were letters to both his parents. Some accounts reported that Charlie had placed stones over the eyes of his dead family members, as well as cushioning their heads with them. To this very day, no one is certain what exactly drove Charlie Lawson to slaughter his entire family, with the exception of young Arthur, before taking his life. Some speculate that Lawson had been abusing Marie and that she may well have been pregnant with an inbred child at the time of her death. Others have insisted that Charlie could not have had the capacity to commit the heinous acts that occurred on the family farm that Christmas Day, and that the entire thing had been staged to frame Charlie. A more credible explanation is that Charlie had developed a medical condition that affected his actions and caused him to experience a psychotic break. Perhaps he had knocked a screw loose after suffering a head injury while digging a ditch on the farm. Or, as some reported, he had some kind of painful growth on his chest that had him in constant agony, and he had decided to end it all and take his family with him. The killing attracted so much attention that an estimated 5,000 curiosity seekers attended the Lawson family funeral. They were all buried in a single large plot in the private Browder family cemetery just outside of Germantown. The house became a macabre tourist attraction after the incident, and Charlie's brother decided to open the house to the public, charging admission for tours of the property. Still on the counter sat the cake that Marie had been making. Even after the house had been closed, the cake made its rounds in traveling dye museums. Protective plastic had to be used to cover the cake after several onlookers swiped some raisins. The cake toured for at least a decade before surviving family members buried the cake along with the awful memories that came with it. Though the home was later demolished, the area still has enough spooky history to have inspired ghost sightings of the doomed Lawson children and the murderous Charlie Lawson. Unbelievably, the tragedy of the Lawson family didn't end in 1929. In 1945, James Arthur Lawson, the only child to survive the Christmas Day bloodshed, died at the age of 31 in a truck accident in Walnut Cove, North Carolina, quite near Germantown. He was buried in the same cemetery as the rest of his family, leaving behind 4 children of his own. When news of Arthur's death reached the local community, rumors of a family curse abounded. They insisted that Charlie had reached out to claim his son from beyond the grave. The murders also inspired the famed bluegrass duo, the Stanley Brothers, to pen a suitably morbid tune, recounting the Lawson family fate. The song includes the following lyrics. They say he killed his wife at first while the little ones did cry. Please, Papa, won't you spare our lives? It is so hard to die. This happened back in 2004. I had just graduated college and started my career in healthcare at a hospital 2 hours away from where I grew up. The hospital I worked at was massive, a level 1 trauma center. I worked in a highly specialized area, and there were only 2 other people at the hospital with my licensure. This is important because, in our department, we spent a lot of time working alone. We had to stagger our shifts to ensure there was coverage. I had the early shift, arriving at 5:45 in the morning. The staff parking lot was several city blocks away from the hospital, and a shuttle would pick employees up from there. The lot was surrounded by an urban forest, as the city tried to preserve as much green space as possible. There was nothing else near the parking lot at that time. Since I arrived so early, I had to call the shuttle service when I got there. The call button was located at the shuttle stop, meaning I had to leave my car to communicate with dispatch. I always felt uneasy because, even though there were parked cars, there were never any employees around when I arrived. The overnight shift didn't end until 7 a.m., and a few weeks after I started working there, I had settled into the shuttle routine and felt more comfortable. At that time, cell phone service was spotty at best, and I didn't own a smartphone, so I didn't have reliable service. One afternoon, when I returned to my car, I found a note on the windshield that read, "Asterisk, hot and sweet you are. Asterisk." I looked around but didn't see anyone. I was perplexed but not really scared. Another week passed, and I forgot about the note. That is, until one afternoon when I came back to my car and found a flower tucked into the windshield wiper, along with another note. This one read, "Asterisk, I really love your dimples. I could make you smile." Asterisk. I was taken aback. I had just moved to this town and didn't know anyone except the 2 other people in my department. I didn't have any friends outside of work, so I had no idea who could have left the notes. By this point, I definitely felt creeped out. It was starting to feel like I was being watched. In the early mornings, I began parking as close to the shuttle stop as possible, buzzing dispatch for the shuttle, and then waiting in my car with the doors locked. I often thought I heard shuffling noises, like shoes scraping through the gravel, but I couldn't see all the way to the dark corners of the lot. When I returned to my car in the afternoons, I started carrying my pepper spray just in case. I told my coworkers about the notes, and they suggested I report it to security. I felt a little silly, but I made a report. Security said they would keep an eye out, whatever that meant. I stopped parking in that lot, opting instead to find parking on the street nearer to the hospital where there were other people around. Things went fine for the next few weeks until one day I got another note. This time, it was on my car one morning outside my apartment building. In the same scribbly handwriting, it simply read, "Don't be shy." I was so confused. What did this person want? Obviously, they were following me, and now they knew where I lived and probably knew I lived alone. I contacted the police. There wasn't much they could do, but they did make some safety recommendations and said they would patrol the neighborhood more often. I took a self-defense class and was hyper-aware of my surroundings. It was worse not knowing who I was dealing with. A few weeks later, a woman was found assaulted and murdered in the trees behind the employee parking lot. They caught the guy a couple days later. I recognized him. He was a contract painter who had been working in my area. The hospital had been remodeling our department, and this painter would come in early around 6:30 a.m. I made coffee every morning in the break room, and he would come in to get a cup. We made small talk a few times, but never any red flags. Then it came back to me. Sometimes he would call me Dimples. I shivered. Good morning, Dimples. I was shocked that he had literally been right under my nose for weeks. I had been totally alone with him on many occasions, and I never suspected anything. I don't know for certain that he was the one leaving the notes, but they stopped after he was arrested. Anyway, stay safe out there, guys and gals. It began as just another routine drive, one of those late-night journeys along a desolate highway. My headlights pierced the dark, the sound of my car the only thing breaking the silence around me. The road stretched endlessly, a black ribbon ahead with nothing but the faint glow of distant stars overhead. I wasn't rushing, but there was an uneasy sensation that lingered in the air. The atmosphere felt thick, the quiet unusually deep, and my heartbeat, well, it was a little quicker than usual. I'd driven at night plenty of times, and honestly, I usually enjoy it. There's something calming about it. The road all to myself, the world asleep while I'm out there. But that night, it felt off, like a strange calm before something unsettling. Around midnight, I noticed the car behind me. Initially, I thought nothing of it. Just another set of headlights in my rearview mirror, about 100 yards back, keeping pace with me. But after a while, I realized something wasn't right. The car wasn't overtaking me. It stayed behind, never making any move to pass, even though the road was clear for miles. It was just sitting there, maintaining a constant, deliberate distance, close enough to make me aware of its presence, but not so close that it felt threatening. I tried to brush it off, assuming it was a coincidence. Maybe they were headed the same way. After all, it was just a random car, right? But as the miles ticked on, the unease in me grew. I tried speeding up, just a little, to see if they'd pass. They didn't. I slowed down, hoping they'd go around. Nothing. They kept pace with me, matching my every move. Anxiety twisted in my stomach, and I turned the radio up, hoping the noise would distract me. It didn't help. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I forced myself to breathe and focus on the road. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was late, and maybe my mind was playing tricks, but that car, it was like a shadow, just far enough behind to keep its presence felt, but never revealing what it was doing. About 20 miles later, I passed a sign for a rest stop. Without a second thought, I flicked on my turn signal and veered off the highway, hoping to lose the car behind me. But as soon as I took the ramp, I checked my mirror, half expecting them to zoom past me. They didn't. Instead, they followed me, pulling onto the exit. My heart raced. This was getting way too strange. I tried convincing myself they were just stopping for gas or a quick break, but that feeling in my gut only grew stronger. The rest stop was dim, with only a few flickering streetlights casting weak light over a handful of empty parking spots. I parked near the entrance and shut off the engine, trying to act natural as I glanced in my rearview mirror again. The car parked 2 spaces over. It didn't make sense. Why park so close when there were plenty of open spots? My fingers hovered over the ignition for a second, and I thought about driving off, but something stopped me. Maybe I was just being ridiculous, overthinking things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I got out of the car, pretending to stretch my legs, and casually glanced over at the vehicle. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't make out the driver. My heart thudded in my chest as I quickly made my way toward the rest stop's small convenience store, telling myself I just needed a bottle of water, maybe a snack, something to calm my nerves. Inside, the store was as empty as the parking lot. A bored-looking clerk sat behind the counter, scrolling on his phone, barely glancing up as I entered. I wandered the aisles, my mind racing, trying to act like I wasn't freaking out. After grabbing a bottle of water, I went to the register. That's when I noticed the car through the store's front window. It hadn't moved. The engine was still running, headlights on, casting long shadows across the lot. Whoever was inside wasn't coming out. Busy night? I asked the clerk, trying to sound casual as I handed him a $5 bill. He looked up, then shrugged. Not really, just you? I glanced outside again, feeling my stomach twist. You ever notice people hanging around here late at night? The clerk raised an eyebrow, following my gaze to the car. Sometimes weird stuff happens on the highway, you know? His words didn't help. I grabbed my change and hurried out of the store, hoping I'd find the car gone by the time I got back to mine. But no, it was still there. And as I walked across the lot, I saw it. The driver's side door cracked open, just slightly. My breath hitched as I quickened my pace, fumbling for my keys. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and slid inside, locking the doors with shaky fingers. My hands were slick with sweat as I started the engine, but my eyes kept darting to the other car. Whoever was inside hadn't stepped out, but I could feel the weight of their gaze, like they were waiting for something or someone. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the lot, tires screeching as I merged back onto the highway. My heart was racing, and I told myself I was in the clear. Whatever that had been, it was over. But as I checked my rearview mirror, I saw them again, those same headlights. They were following me, again. This time, they were closer. Panic surged through me. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, but the other car stayed right behind me, its headlights growing brighter in my mirrors. I tried to shake them by weaving through the lanes, taking random exits, but no matter where I went, they followed. At one point, I slowed down just enough to let them pass, hoping to catch a glimpse of the driver. But instead of speeding past, the car pulled up alongside me, keeping pace for a few terrifying seconds. My eyes flicked over, and in the dim light, I saw a silhouette behind the wheel. A dark figure appeared in my rearview mirror, their face hidden, staring ahead with an unnerving intensity. My pulse surged in my ears as I pressed the gas pedal, desperate to distance myself. For a brief moment, the car dropped back, and I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, I had lost them. But then they accelerated again, closing the gap. I had no idea what they wanted, but I knew I didn't want to stick around to find out. My only objective now was to get to a place with people, any place where I could feel safe. After what seemed like forever with the car still trailing behind, I finally saw the bright glow of a gas station ahead, its lights spilling out onto the pitch-black highway. I quickly turned off the road and pulled into the lot, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I expected the car to follow me in, but to my relief, it didn't. Instead, it sped past, its taillights disappearing into the night as it vanished down the road. I stayed there for a few minutes, breathing heavily, trying to calm the frantic adrenaline rushing through me. The gas station clerk shot me a curious glance from behind the counter, but I was too shaken to care. All that mattered was that I wasn't alone anymore. That was enough. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together and continued on my way. The rest of the night blurred by, my nerves still tense, but the car never showed up again. To this day, I have no idea who was following me or why. Could have been some kind of sick prank or something darker was at play. Regardless, that drive taught me an unsettling truth. No matter how well you know the road, you can never be sure who's watching from the shadows. It all started when I was 19, and the events continued for several years after. This all ties into my mail, which is important to the story. During my first year of college, I worked part-time at a local grocery store. I did everything from bagging groceries, stocking shelves, cashiering, and working the service desk. Pretty much everything that came with the job. Towards the end of my time there, I found myself mostly working in the front of the store, particularly at the service desk, since I had been there the longest. It was a small grocery store, and over time we developed regular customers. Many of them came in frequently, so we'd get to know each other. At that point, I was young and a bit naive, overly trusting, and that would later come back to bite me. One particular customer, a man who came in about once or twice a week, started standing in my line even when the others were shorter, which wasn't too odd, I guess. I hated working in retail, but I was good with customers, and I got along well with most people. What I found strange, though, was that this wasn't your typical customer who would choose my line. Most of the time, it was older ladies in their 60s or 70s, but this was a guy in his 40s, maybe. But I didn't think much of it at the time. His name was Jeff, though I didn't know that for a while because he always paid in cash. I learned his name the hard way, but we'll get to that. Initially, Jeff seemed harmless. He'd strike up conversations, and if I didn't have a line, we'd chat for a bit. He seemed genuinely interested in my life, but at the time, it didn't seem too odd, aside from the age difference. Jeff asked me casual questions about myself, nothing that raised any red flags at the time. He asked which college I went to, and I told him without a second thought. He also asked about cars, and at one point, he asked which one was mine. The parking lot was clearly visible through the front windows, so I foolishly pointed out my car and said, "It's that one." In a small town like ours, it wasn't uncommon for people to live near each other, so I didn't think much of it when he asked where I lived. I mentioned the name of my town, which was just outside the city where the store was located. Then, without hesitation, when he asked where in the town I lived, I told him the name of my street and even described my house. Looking back, I realized how careless I was. I like to think I'm usually smart in these situations, but I definitely wasn't this time. At the time, I didn't see it, but Jeff was slowly collecting information about me. By the time I realized what was happening, it was far too late. I had told him everything except my phone number and exact address. Then one day, I was working the service desk when Jeff came in and asked me to ring up his groceries. However, I was busy helping another customer with a lottery or money order. Honestly, I can't remember the exact transaction. I told him I couldn't help him at that moment, and for just a second, I saw a flash of frustration on his face before he quickly smiled again. I didn't pay much attention after that because I was still with the other customer, but Jeff just stood there, watching me. I didn't notice at first because the machine I was using was acting up, but he was definitely staring. Eventually, even the customer I was helping noticed. "Hey," he said, "that guy keeps staring at you." That's when I glanced over at Jeff. He wasn't smiling anymore. In fact, he looked pretty angry. But as soon as I locked eyes with him, the smile returned, though it didn't seem genuine. Then Jeff made an odd comment about me wearing a skirt. This was completely out of character for him, and it caught me off guard. I paused, unsure of how to respond as he continued to talk about how I'd look in a skirt or a dress. I just stared at him, my face likely showing the confusion and disbelief I felt. The more he went on, the more unsettled I became. A coworker, Miranda, was working at the service desk with me, along with the customer and another cashier nearby. They all shared the same stunned expressions, probably thinking, "What the hell is going on?" Jeff wasn't stopping, though, so I knew I had to say something to put an end to it. I couldn't even fake amusement. I told him flatly, "I don't know what you're talking about. You'll never see me in anything but this uniform." My tone was firm, and it was clear I wasn't joking. The smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by something I had never seen before. It was anger, but also humiliation, and it was clear he didn't like being rejected. He glared at me, and I felt that stare deep in my bones, like a cold chill running through me. My breath caught in my throat as we locked eyes. I can't even explain it other than to say that it was the most menacing look anyone had ever given me. In that moment, it felt like he was saying, "You'll be sorry." I wasn't sure of it at the time, but looking back, I'm convinced that was his intent. Without another word, he turned and walked away. After that, Jeff never stood in my line again, which I was more than happy about. But he would still talk loudly about me from other registers, making sure to glare at me whenever I was nearby. He'd badmouth me in subtle ways that weren't quite enough to report, but everyone knew exactly who he was talking about, even when he didn't use my name. There were times when I'd be the only cashier working as the store was about to close. Another coworker would be in the office, counting the drawers, while the rest of the staff were in the back or stocking shelves. During these late shifts, I started noticing a car pulling into the parking lot, but the driver never came in. The car had one burnt-out headlight, which made it stand out. And since the large front windows let anyone in the parking lot see directly into the store, I started getting a sinking feeling in my stomach. It took me longer than I care to admit to put two and two together. The only reason I realized who was in the car was pure coincidence. My car was in the shop, so my mom came to pick me up one evening. As I was waiting outside in front of the building, I could see into the car, away from the bright lights of the store. Sure enough, it was Jeff. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and I was completely shocked. That was when I truly understood that something wasn't just strange. It was downright wrong. At that moment, I instinctively backed away, imagining what I'd do if he got out of the car. The door to the store was behind me, and while there were still people inside, they were all in the back. Thankfully, my mom showed up right then, and I didn't tell her what had happened. I knew if I told her, it would only worry her more, so I let it go for the time being. Soon enough, everyone at the store knew about Jeff. It got to the point where, whenever he came in, the staff would immediately tell me to go to the back. They'd even page me overhead when he left, just to make sure I was safe from his presence. I mean, everyone at the store knew about Jeff, even the managers. We were all pretty creeped out by him, especially because of his strange obsession with me. A lot of the time when he came in and didn't see me, he'd just leave right away, or so I was told. I remember one time we didn't notice him walk in, and by the time we did, he was almost at the door. Another cashier, Laura, saw him and immediately looked terrified. Now, Laura wasn't the type to get rattled easily, but Jeff had everyone on edge, particularly because of the way he fixated on me. She urgently told me to get to the back, and at first I didn't notice him and was confused. I started to ask why, but before I could finish, she insisted, "Just go." I remember that moment so clearly, the few seconds between when she said that and when I saw Jeff walking through the door, realizing exactly what was going on. He saw me before I could rush into the back, and I was so unsettled that I locked the back door to the loading dock, just in case he decided to come after me. Once he left, Laura called me back up and told me he gave her a furious look before storming out. I was worried that he'd try to retaliate against her, but luckily, he didn't. Unfortunately, things didn't improve. I started seeing Jeff around town, at the movies, in stores, gas stations, the mall, even at the bank. A couple of these instances might have been coincidental, I guess, but they were happening so often that I was sure it wasn't. It was Jeff, and I could feel it. I still didn't have proof he was stalking me, though, and I hadn't told my parents yet. At the time, I was commuting to school from home, and I was often out late. By this point, it was winter and it got dark early. There were times when I'd leave campus, and soon after, I'd notice a car behind me with one headlight. A couple of times could have just been coincidence, but at this point, it was happening nearly every week. Even then, I still didn't tell my parents, though I was pretty sure it was him. Then one night, as I walked out of school and into the dark, deserted parking lot, I saw a car parked in a far corner, with its lights off. I didn't think much of it at first, but then the headlights flicked on, and sure enough, it was just one headlight. I knew instantly it was him. I ran to my car, threw everything inside, and got out of there as fast as I could. After that, I started walking out with either security guards or friends whenever I could. A couple of times, I thought I saw his car, but he never turned his lights on unless I was alone. He wouldn't approach me or follow me directly, but it felt like he was just watching, taunting me, letting me know he was there. This continued even after I quit working at the store. I became a tutor at school, but his stalking, because that's what it was, I was sure of it now, didn't stop. One evening, I was at a friend's house, and when I drove home, I realized I had forgotten something. Instead of pulling into my driveway, I decided to loop around the block, so I drove past my house. This night, I was home alone. My parents were out, and both my siblings lived elsewhere, so the house was dark. There shouldn't have been anyone in the driveway, especially since I had just spoken to my parents, and they were nowhere near home. But as I drove by, I saw the dark shape of a car and the glow of taillights. Sometimes people would turn around in our driveway because it was so large, so at first, I thought maybe that's what it was or that someone was having car trouble. But then, the car pulled out after me, and when I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw it clearly. It had one headlight. That meant Jeff had been waiting at my house for me. He followed me for a while and I couldn't go home. I didn't want to lead him to my friends' houses either, so I drove back to the store where I used to work. I rushed inside, trying to see if he had followed me there by looking out the windows. Miranda was working that night and asked me what was going on, but I couldn't speak. I just looked at her, and she understood right away. Her eyes widened in shock, and she couldn't say anything either. After that night, Jeff began following me even more. He'd show up at my school more often, and it was as if he knew my schedule. He knew exactly where I'd be and when I'd be there. I started shuddering, thinking about the times I hadn't seen him, but he had been watching me for who knows how long. It wasn't just my schedule he had learned. He seemed to know my parents' schedule too, at least when I'd be home alone. A few times, I'd hear a car pull into the driveway at night, and I just knew it was him before I even looked. But he never got out of the car that I could see, and he would only stay for about 10 minutes. These visits usually happened on Wednesday or Sunday nights, when my parents were at church, so I started avoiding the house during those times. I'd stay at school to study, hang out with friends, or go to the movies. I occasionally babysat for someone at my parents' church, but eventually, I stopped doing that, fearing he might follow me there. It was around this time that I decided I needed to look into Jeff. I didn't even know his last name, but something told me to check the sex offender database. One day, at my friend Jill's house, we did just that. We looked through various pictures of local offenders and were shocked at how many were listed nearby. Eventually, one thumbnail caught my eye. It was hard to tell if it was him, but I clicked to open a larger image and more information. Jill's internet was slow, so the page took its time to load. His name came up first, Jeff. We waited for the image to load, and when it finally did, I couldn't breathe for a moment because I knew instantly that it was him. That's how I learned his name, and that the man stalking me was actually a sexual predator. I didn't know what to do with this information. He hadn't broken any laws, at least not directly, so I didn't know what steps to take. But at this point, I realized I had to tell my parents. I told them everything, and they were shocked. They had no idea. Jeff had been really good at hiding his actions, and it made me think that he wasn't just bad at being subtle with me. No, Jeff wanted me to know. He wanted me to know that I was being watched, that I was his obsession. My dad was furious. I could tell that if he knew where Jeff was, he would have gone after him to threaten him into leaving me alone. But my mom was terrified, really scared. She even cried a little. We briefly discussed calling the police, but, again, Jeff hadn't done anything illegal beyond possibly trespassing on our property, and I couldn't prove it was him. All we could do was stay vigilant. I thought telling my parents would make me feel better, but to be honest, it made me feel worse. However, they had to know, and everyone in my life needed to know, so I told them. We started taking precautions. By this point, I was in my 30s, but I felt like a child. I didn't have a curfew anymore, but my parents were hesitant to leave me alone, even during the day. My dad's usually not easily shaken, so it was unsettling to see him so disturbed by everything that was happening. We started keeping the cats inside and made sure to keep an eye on the dogs when they were out. More times than I can count, I'd find myself sitting on the back steps after letting them out, just watching them, with the constant feeling that I was being watched too. By that point, I never felt safe, never felt comfortable. Could have just been my paranoia, but I'm not sure. My mom got me pepper spray and I started carrying it everywhere, always on me even when I was out of the house. At night, I even began taking a knife to bed. But Jeff didn't stop. I remember one time being at a friend's apartment, and while she was in the bathroom, the front door started rattling like someone was trying to get in. Luckily, it was locked, and by the time she came out, it had stopped. I didn't tell her about it at first because I knew she wouldn't be staying the night there, so she wouldn't be alone. After that, I just stopped going to friends' houses altogether. I stopped going anywhere if I could help it, especially alone. This whole nightmare went on for years. Even after I finished college, it didn't stop. For at least 5 years, I dealt with it, and when I finally moved into my own place, I was terrified. But I'd seen him less and less by then, and I didn't want to keep living with my parents. Things were okay for a while. There were weeks, sometimes even months, between sightings of Jeff. Then one day, I saw him at the store. I left immediately, not wanting him to notice me. I didn't think he had, but as I made a few other stops before heading home, I realized I couldn't let myself get complacent. I always made sure my doors and windows were locked when I wasn't home, and even when I was home, especially at night or if I just had a bad feeling. I'd been doing this for years, long before the whole Jeff situation started. So I knew there was no way I had left my door unlocked, and slightly open at that. Something wasn't right. I know I should have called the police, but I felt this strange mix of frustration and defiance. I think I was just so tired of feeling helpless that I wanted to take control of the situation myself. So when I saw the door like that, I grabbed my pepper spray and went inside. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and searched the place. Every closet, under every bed, everywhere someone could be hiding. But luckily, no one was there. It was terrifying, honestly. I kept expecting Jeff to jump out from somewhere, but he never did. Despite that, I couldn't sleep there that night. I didn't want anyone to know about what happened, so I got a hotel room for the night. I never told anyone about that incident because it felt like a line had been crossed. One I couldn't ignore. I didn't have proof that it was him, but deep down, I knew it was. I never called the police, though, because nothing was missing, and there were no signs of a break-in. But I knew he'd been there. I could feel it. It's terrifying to think about what could have happened if I had been home when he showed up. Unless you've been through something like this, it's hard to understand how it eats away at you, how it shatters your trust and sense of safety. It's something you don't realize you've taken for granted until it's stripped away. There's this feeling of security that I lost, and I don't think I'll ever get it back. It's been years since I've heard from Jeff, and I still live in the same area. I have no idea if he's still watching me, though. Most of the time, I think he's either moved on or maybe even ended up in jail. But every now and then, when I'm parking in a lot or home alone, I get this feeling, the one I've come to associate with him. Maybe it's just paranoia, a gift from him when he talked about me wearing a dress. I hope that's all it is, but sometimes I wonder. This whole ordeal has become a part of my life now, and I try not to talk about it much, but everyone I know is aware of it. It's like the elephant in the room. I've changed a lot since then. I've got anxiety now, and I've become extremely private. I'm not sure if it's all because of this, but I know it's at least a big factor. I'm still cautious, and I don't like going out alone after dark. I still lock all my doors and windows, whether it's nighttime or not, and even if I'm not alone. I lock the bathroom door every time I shower, and I check the locks at least 3 times before I go to bed. I still get nervous if anything seems out of place or if something's missing that should be where I left it. I carry pepper spray with me during the day, and I still take a knife to bed with me. All these years later, and I can't shake the need to feel protected. The wilderness was supposed to clear my mind, not fill it with terror. But as I stared at the circle of rocks surrounding my tent, rocks that hadn't been there when I fell asleep, I realized that some things in nature aren't meant to be understood, only feared. I'd always been the outdoorsy type, finding solace in the quiet of the forest and the challenge of rugged terrain. But after a messy breakup and losing my job in the same week, I needed more than just a weekend hike. I needed to lose myself in the wilderness, to strip away the complications of modern life and find myself again. The Appalachian Trail seemed like the perfect solution. Miles of pristine forest, challenging enough to occupy my body and mind, but well-traveled enough that I wouldn't be completely isolated. I packed light, just the essentials. A small tent, sleeping bag, some dried food, and basic survival gear. The plan was to hike for a week, maybe 2, however long it took to clear my head. The first few days were exactly what I needed. The physical exertion of climbing hills and navigating rough terrain left me pleasantly exhausted each night. The fresh air and stunning vistas worked like a balm on my troubled mind. I felt myself relaxing, the knot of anxiety in my chest slowly unraveling. It was on the 4th night that things began to change. I'd found a perfect little clearing to set up camp, far enough off the main trail to feel secluded. but not so far that I risked getting lost. As I sat by my small campfire, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the forest, I felt truly at peace for the first time in months. I must have dozed off there by the fire, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to complete darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night had grown cold. But that wasn't what had woken me. There was a sound, just at the edge of hearing, a soft whispering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up, instantly alert, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The whispering continued, rising and falling like waves on a shore. I couldn't make out words, but there was a rhythm to it, almost like chanting. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared in the vast silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" The whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so profound. It felt like a physical presence, pressing in on me from all sides. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around my campsite. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone or anything that could have made those sounds. But as I swept the light around, something caught my eye. Just at the edge of the clearing was a small pile of rocks. I frowned, certain that hadn't been there earlier. It was a simple stack, just 5 or 6 stones balanced on top of each other. Probably just some fellow hiker marking the spot, I told myself. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. I'd chosen this spot precisely because it was off the beaten path. I climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight as if the thin fabric could protect me from whatever was out there. Sleep was long in coming, and when it did, it was filled with unsettling dreams of whispered voices and shadows moving just out of sight. I woke to birdsong, the cheerful sound, a stark contrast to the eerie atmosphere of the night before. In the light of day, my fears seemed foolish. I'd probably imagined the whispering, my mind playing tricks in the unfamiliar silence of the deep forest and the rock pile. Well, I must have just missed it when I set up camp. But as I crawled out of my tent, ready to laugh off my night terrors, I froze. The small pile of rocks I'd seen the night before was gone. In its place was a perfect circle of stones surrounding my entire campsite. My heart began to race. This was no trick of the mind, no half-remembered dream. Someone or something had been in my camp while I slept. Meticulously arranging these rocks around me, I spun around scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me. But the forest was quiet, peaceful even, betraying no sign of the nocturnal activities that had taken place. With shaking hands, I began to pack up my camp. Whatever was going on here, I wanted no part of it. I'd hiked back to the main trail and figure out my next move from there. As I was rolling up my tent, I heard it again. That soft, insistent whispering. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, beckoning me. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn towards the sound. I pushed through the underbrush, branches scratching at my face and arms. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out any words. It led me to another clearing, smaller than the one I'd camped in. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The clearing was filled with stone circles, dozens of them, ranging from tiny rings the size of my palm to massive formations that must have taken multiple people to construct. And there, in the center of it all, was a symbol carved into the trunk of a massive oak tree, a crude circle with a line drawn through it. I approached the tree, my hand reaching out almost of its own accord to trace the carving. As my fingers touched the rough bark, the whispering suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from behind me, a twig snapped. I whirled around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. Where its face should have been was only a smooth, blank expanse of skin. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going. I could hear it behind me, moving with a speed that defied its awkward appearance. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that panicked flight. But eventually, I burst out onto the main trail, gasping for breath. My legs shook with exertion. A group of hikers stared at me in alarm. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, taking in my wild appearance and terrified expression. I opened my mouth to explain, to warn them about what was in those woods. But as I turned to point back the way I'd come, I saw only peaceful forest. No sign of pursuit. No unnaturally tall figure. Nothing. I got lost. I managed to stammer out. Took a wrong turn off the trail. They nodded sympathetically, offering me water and a granola bar. As my breathing slowed and my panic receded, doubt crept in. Had I imagined it all? Was it just fear and isolation playing tricks on my mind? But then, just as the hikers were about to continue on their way, one of them paused. He was looking at something on the ground just off the trail. My blood ran cold as I realized what it was. A small pile of rocks, stacked neatly one on top of the other. "Wonder who left this here?" the hiker mused. I didn't stay to chat. I hiked out that day, pushing myself to exhaustion to reach the nearest town. I never went back to finish my hike. Never told anyone the full story of what I'd seen. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear it again. That soft, insistent chanting. And I know that out there, deep in the woods where few people venture, something is waiting. Something that builds circles of stone and carves ancient symbols into trees. Something that watches, whispers, and lures unsuspecting hikers off the beaten path. So, if you're ever hiking in the wilderness and you come across a strange pile of rocks or hear whispers on the wind, remember my story. Don't investigate. Don't try to understand. Just turn around and head back to civilization as fast as you can. Because some things in nature aren't meant to be understood, only feared and avoided at all costs. And whatever you do, never, ever sleep in a place surrounded by stone circles. Because you never know what might be there when you wake up. The silence was meant to be peaceful, a break from the noise, but it quickly transformed into a breeding ground for terror, filling the stillness with paranoia and unease. What had started as a simple weekend retreat turned into a nightmare that continues to haunt me, leaving me to wonder about the true nature of solitude and the hidden threats that hide in the quiet corners of the world. I had been anticipating this trip for months. The grind of city life, the relentless honking of traffic, the constant hum of people, and the mounting pressure of never-ending deadlines had drained me. When I found the listing for a remote cabin deep in the woods, it seemed like the perfect way to escape. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me and nature. A chance to reset, to reconnect with myself away from the chaos. The drive up was scenic, winding through thick forests and alongside sparkling streams. When I turned onto the gravel path leading to the cabin, the trees seemed to envelop me, creating a tunnel that guided me toward my weekend refuge. The cabin itself was quaint and charming, its rustic simplicity inviting. It was a small wooden building with a covered porch, like something out of a fairy tale. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and inhaled deeply, taking in the fresh, pine-scented air. Already, the tension in my shoulders began to ease. Inside, the cabin was cozy, well-kept, and exactly what I needed. A stone fireplace took up one wall of the living room, and a compact kitchenette filled one corner. The bedroom was snug, with a window that framed the surrounding woods. It wasn't glamorous, but it was perfect for what I wanted. I spent the afternoon settling in, putting away groceries, and wandering around the cabin's immediate surroundings. There was a small clearing in the back, ideal for stargazing, and a well-trodden path that led down to a creek. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I started a fire in the fireplace and sank into an armchair with a book and a glass of wine. The silence was deep, almost sacred. There were no cars, no distant sirens, not even the hum of electronics. Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I relished in the stillness, feeling the last remnants of city stress slowly fade away. It was nearly midnight when I decided to call it a night. I banked the fire, locked the doors, not so much out of fear, but simply out of habit, and slipped into bed. The mattress was firm yet comfortable, and I fell asleep almost instantly, comforted by the absolute quiet. I'm not sure what woke me. It could have been a noise, or perhaps it was just that deep, unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. I lay still in the darkness, heart racing, straining to listen. For a long while, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. My first thought was that it must be an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon foraging around the cabin. But as I listened, the footsteps seemed too deliberate, too measured to be an animal. They circled the cabin slowly, pausing occasionally before continuing on. I slid out of bed, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Moving to the window, I peered out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale light over the clearing, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps continued, now on the far side of the cabin. A chill ran down my spine. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I thought about the isolation that had seemed so appealing just hours before. Now it felt oppressive, dangerous. I crept to the main room, checking the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure, just as I had left it. The footsteps completed their circuit of the cabin and fell silent. I stood there in the darkness, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I convinced myself that I had imagined it all. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest playing tricks on my city-trained ears. I laughed softly at my own paranoia and went back to bed. Morning came, bright and clear. I awoke feeling refreshed, the unsettling events of the night fading like a bad dream in the light of day. I made coffee and decided to enjoy it on the porch, soaking in the beauty of the forest. As I stepped outside, my mug slipped from my fingers, shattering on the wooden planks. There, in the center of the clearing, was a small pile of rocks, 5 or 6 stones, stacked neatly on top of each other. It hadn't been there yesterday. I was sure of it. My mind raced. Had someone been here while I slept? But why leave a pile of rocks? It seemed so odd, so purposeless. I approached it cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at me. But it was just rocks, cold and inert in the morning sun. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I hiked down to the creek, splashed in the cold water, and even managed to spot a deer grazing in a distant meadow. By the time evening rolled around, I had almost convinced myself that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the rock pile. Maybe the property owner had been by to check on things and decided to indulge in some impromptu rock stacking. As darkness fell, I found myself growing tense again. Every creak of the cabin settling, every rustle of leaves outside seemed magnified. I built another fire, hoping its warm glow would dispel the shadows that seemed to lurk in every corner. I must have dozed off in the armchair because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to the sound of knocking. 3 sharp raps on the front door, clear and unmistakable. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Who's there?" No answer, just silence, heavy and oppressive. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. The knocking came again, this time from the back door. I whirled around, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. I lunged for my phone, forgetting for a moment that there was no service out here. My hands shook as I tried to dial 911 anyway, praying for a miracle. Nothing. The screen mockingly displayed no signal, as another series of knocks echoed through the cabin, this time from the bedroom window. Panic overwhelmed me. I grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it out in front of me like a sword. "I'm armed," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Leave me alone." The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was no sound but my own ragged breathing. Then, softly at first but growing louder, I heard laughter. It seemed to come from all around the cabin, a chorus of mocking chuckles that made my blood run cold. I backed into a corner, the poker clutched to my chest, and waited. The laughter faded, replaced once again by that awful silence. I don't know how long I stood there, every muscle tense, expecting at any moment for the doors to burst open, but nothing happened. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Whatever had been out there, it seemed to have gone. Exhausted and shaken, I waited until the sun was fully up before stepping outside. What I saw made my heart race. Surrounding the cabin, spaced about 10 feet apart, were more of those rock piles. Dozens of them, each one identical to the one I had found the day before. I didn't waste time packing. I just grabbed my keys and ran to my car. As I sped down the gravel driveway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I drove straight to the local police station, my story spilling out in a frantic mess. They were polite but clearly skeptical. They took my statement and assured me they'd check out the cabin, but I could see in their eyes they didn't truly believe me. When they called a few days later, their report was disappointingly uneventful. They'd found no signs of intruders, no footprints, and no rock piles. The cabin was exactly as it should be, peaceful, undisturbed, sitting quietly in its forest clearing. I've tried to reason it away. Maybe it was stress or an overactive imagination, fueled by too many horror movies. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. Something was out there in those woods. Something that played with me for reasons I'll never understand. I've never returned to that cabin, or any cabin for that matter. The peace and solitude I once craved now feel like an invitation to something unknown and terrifying. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I catch myself listening for footsteps, for knocking or that mocking laughter. And with a shiver of fear, I wonder if whatever was in those woods has followed me home. The rock piles haunt my dreams. Simple stacks of stones that have come to symbolize an encounter I can neither fully explain nor forget. They stand as silent sentinels in my nightmares, reminding me that sometimes the most terrifying things leave no trace except for the indelible mark they leave on our minds. My body felt heavy, unresponsive. Gus moved closer, and in the dim light, I noticed that his eyes were no longer warm, no longer filled with kindness. They were cold, calculating, and carried a hunger that chilled me to my core. "You see," he said, his voice low and eerie, "it gets so lonely out here, but the forest, she provides. She brings me company like you, and in return, I give her offerings." I tried to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but my body refused to obey. As Gus reached for me, his fingers unnaturally long and sharp, I realized with a sickening clarity that I had walked right into a trap. The cabin I had thought would be my salvation was anything but. The nightmare I had hoped to leave behind was only just beginning. The last thing I remember, before the darkness swallowed me, was Gus's voice, soft and almost affectionate as he whispered, "Don't worry, my dear, you'll be part of the forest forever now. And I'll never be alone again." The shortcut was meant to save me time. Instead, it pulled me into a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined. As I navigated the narrow, unfamiliar road, the shadows seemed to stretch deeper, the houses more decayed, and a heavy sense of unease settled in my stomach. I should have turned around right then, but I kept going, unaware that with every passing moment, I was sealing my fate. It had been one of those draining days at work, the kind where everything goes wrong and it feels like the universe is conspiring against you. I was tired, on edge, and just wanted to get back to my apartment for a glass of wine. When my GPS suggested a shortcut that would save me 15 minutes on my usual drive, I didn't hesitate to follow it. At first, the neighborhood seemed ordinary enough. Older homes, sure, with peeling paint and overgrown lawns, but nothing too unusual for this area of town. But as I ventured further into the twisting streets, subtle changes started to occur. The streetlights, which should have been flickering to life as dusk settled in, stayed dark. The few cars parked along the curb were ancient, caked in dust, like they hadn't moved in years. And the people, where was everyone? No one walking dogs, no kids playing outside. The whole neighborhood felt deserted. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning pale. Something was wrong, but I couldn't quite place it. My GPS beeped, telling me to turn left onto Shadowwood Lane. Even the name sent a chill down my spine. As I made the turn, the houses seemed to close in, their windows dark and vacant, like empty eye sockets staring at me. The trees lining the street were twisted, their limbs stretching over the road like clawing hands. That's when I saw them. People, but not like any people I'd ever seen before. They emerged from between houses, from behind trees, even seeming to materialize out of thin air. Men, women, children, all moving with an eerie, fluid motion. Their skin was pale, nearly translucent in the dimming light, and their eyes. God, their eyes were wrong. Too big, too dark, locked on my car as I passed. My heart raced, and I could feel a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I had to get out of there, fast. I pressed the gas, but the car didn't respond. The engine sputtered and choked. To my horror, I felt the car start to slow. Panic surged through me as I slammed the pedal, but it was useless. The car came to a halt in the middle of the street. For a moment, everything was quiet. I sat frozen, my breath loud in the stillness of the car, as the strange figures began to approach. They moved slowly, leisurely, as if they had all the time in the world, as if they knew I wasn't going anywhere. I tried to start the car again, turning the key with shaking hands. The engine made a pitiful whining noise, but refused to turn over. My phone. I could call for help, but when I grabbed it from the cup holder, the screen was black, dead. I hadn't noticed the battery draining, but now it was useless. A tap on my window made me jump. I turned to see a face pressed against the glass, inches from my own. It was a woman, or something that looked like a woman. Her skin was so pale it was almost translucent, blue veins visible beneath the surface. Her eyes were huge, pitch black, with no whites visible. She smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "Car trouble?" she asked, her voice muffled through the glass but still sending chills down my spine. It was too high, too sweet, like a parody of a real voice. I shook my head, unable to speak. More of them had gathered around my car now, their dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like a butterfly pinned to a board. "You should come out," another voice said, this one belonging to a man standing near my rear bumper. "Now it's not safe to stay in there?" A hysteric laugh bubbled up in my throat. "Not safe in here as opposed to out there with them." "No, thank you," I managed to croak out. "I'm fine. I'll just wait for help." The woman's smile widened, stretching her face in a way that shouldn't have been possible. "Oh, but we are the help," she said. "We've been waiting for you." A chill ran through me at her words. Waiting for me? How was that possible? I'd never been to this neighborhood before, never even knew it existed until my GPS led me here. As if reading my thoughts, the woman's hand moved to the door handle. "Don't worry about how or why," she said softly. "Just know that you're home now. You're where you belong." The door lock clicked open of its own accord. I scrambled to hit the lock button, but it was no use. As soon as I locked it, it would unlock again. Panic overwhelmed me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I climbed into the back seat, pressing myself against the opposite door. They were opening the driver's side door now, reaching in with those too long, too pale hands. I fumbled with the handle of the back door, my sweaty fingers slipping on the metal. Just as I felt a cold hand grasp my ankle, the door gave way, and I tumbled out onto the pavement. I didn't think. I just ran. My legs pumped furiously as I sprinted down the dark street, the sound of my ragged breathing loud in my ears. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps unnaturally quiet, but somehow still audible over the pounding of my heart. Houses flew by in a blur as I ran, each one looking more decrepit and wrong than the last. The trees seemed to bend towards me, their branches reaching out as if trying to snatch me up. I took random turns, left, right, left again, hoping to lose my pursuers in the maze-like streets. But no matter how fast I ran, how many turns I took, I could still feel them behind me. Their presence was like a physical weight on my back, growing heavier with each step. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw it. A gap between two houses, leading to what looked like a more normal street beyond. Street lights glowed warmly, and I could see cars moving in the distance. Safety, normalcy. With a final burst of speed, I lunged for the gap. As I passed between the houses, I felt something tug at my clothes, heard a hiss of frustration behind me. But then I was through, stumbling onto a well-lit sidewalk. I turned, half expecting to see my pursuers emerging from the darkness. But the gap I'd just run through was gone. In its place stood an unyielding wall. The bricks were worn, blending seamlessly as though they had been there for decades. I stood frozen, gasping for air, my mind struggling to comprehend the bizarre events that had just unfolded. People walked by me on the sidewalk, casting curious glances, but otherwise, they paid me no attention. Cars sped past, their headlights cutting through the busy street, as if the nightmare neighborhood I'd just been in had never existed. In a fog, I managed to hail a taxi and gave the driver my address. As we passed through familiar streets, I tried to piece together what I had just gone through. Had it been real? Was it a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion, or some elaborate prank? But deep down, I knew. The fear had been far too real, the strangeness too intense to be anything other than the truth. Somehow, I had found myself in a place I wasn't meant to be, a place that seemed determined to keep me. Once home, I immediately opened maps on my computer, searching for any trace of Shadowwood Lane or the twisted neighborhood I'd driven through. But there was nothing. Every map, every city record, showed the area as just another ordinary residential zone, indistinguishable from any other in the city. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I changed my route home, avoiding any chance of getting near that area again. I threw myself into work, into social events, anything to keep my mind busy. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a pale face staring through my window, gone by the time I turn to look. Or I'll be driving and suddenly realize the street signs look unfamiliar. The house on the corner is a little too dark, too still. In those moments, my heart races, and I'm back in that place, running for my life through those shadowed streets. And I wonder, did I really escape? Or are they still out there, patiently waiting for me to make another wrong turn, to wander back to the place that claims me as its own? I don't know if I'll ever get the answers, but one thing is certain. I will never trust a shortcut again. The walls seemed to breathe, a slow in and out motion that made my stomach twist. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself my eyes were playing tricks. But when I looked again, the decaying hallway of the abandoned asylum continued its eerie, rhythmic pulsation. My friends, completely oblivious to the nightmarish sight, pressed deeper into the building's depths. As I hesitated, a cold shiver ran down my spine. We'd come for a thrill, but I was starting to realize we'd stumbled into something much darker, and getting out might not be as easy as just walking back the way we came. It had all started as a dare, really. The five of us, Mike, Sarah, Jess, Alex, and myself, had been swapping urban legends over beers when Mike mentioned the old Ravenscroft Asylum on the outskirts of town. Abandoned for decades, it was infamous for being severely haunted. Locals whispered about strange lights, eerie screams, and explorers who ventured inside but never emerged. "We should check it out," Mike had said, his eyes gleaming with that special bravado only a few drinks could inspire. "Tonight, unless you're all too chicken." I should have said no. We all should have. But caught up in the excitement, fueled by alcohol and the urge to prove ourselves, we piled into Mike's battered Jeep and drove out to Ravenscroft. The asylum stood before us, a dark, imposing figure against the starry night sky. Its windows were empty sockets, staring out from a crumbling face of brick. As we approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was watching us, evaluating us as potential prey. "Last chance to back out," Sarah whispered, her voice betraying the nervousness she was trying so hard to hide. But Mike was already forging ahead, flashlight in hand, and the rest of us followed like lambs to the slaughter. The interior of Ravenscroft was a maze of decaying corridors and rooms filled with the remnants of its dark past. Rusted gurneys, ancient medical tools, and graffiti-covered walls told the story of decades of neglect. The air was thick with dust and the stench of decay. At first, it felt almost underwhelming. We crept through the halls, startled by our own shadows and echoing footsteps, but nothing truly frightening appeared. Mike led the way, his confidence growing with each empty room we explored. "See," he said, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. "Nothing to worry about, just a bunch of old ghost stories." That's when things started to shift. It began subtly. A door slammed shut behind us, even though there was no breeze. The sound of footsteps when all of us were standing still. A child's laughter echoing from a distant corridor. "Honkies," Jess said, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should go back." But as we turned to retrace our steps, we found ourselves facing an unfamiliar hallway. Somehow, without realizing it, we had become turned around in the labyrinthine building. "No problem," Alex said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "We'll just find another way out." That's when I first noticed the walls. The subtle movement, like the building itself was alive and breathing. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was just a trick of the light. But the motion continued, growing more pronounced with each passing second. "Do you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They all turned to look, and I saw the moment realization dawned on their faces. The color drained from Mike's cheeks, his earlier bravado evaporating like mist and sunlight. "What the hell?" Sarah breathed, reaching out to touch the undulating wall. As her fingers made contact, she jerked back with a yelp. "It's warm." Panic began to set in. We started moving faster, our earlier caution forgotten in the face of this impossible, terrifying phenomenon. Corridors twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the asylum's heart. Doors that should have led to exits opened onto more hallways or rooms filled with unspeakable horrors. Operating theaters with blood-stained tables, padded cells with claw marks on the walls. And all the while, the building seemed to be coming alive around us. The walls pulsed faster, the floor beneath our feet becoming soft and yielding, like walking on flesh rather than tile. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the coppery scent of blood. "We need to get out of here," Jess screamed, her composure finally breaking. She took off running down a hallway, ignoring our shouts to stay together. We heard her scream, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly. When we rounded the corner, she was gone. The hallway ended in a solid wall, as if it had never contained a doorway at all. "This isn't happening," Alex muttered, running his hands through his hair. "This can't be real." But it was real, all too horrifyingly real. We pressed on, our group now down to 4, searching desperately for an exit. But it seemed the more we searched, the more lost we became. The asylum was a living maze, constantly shifting and changing around us. At one point, we found ourselves in what must have been the main lobby. A grand staircase led up to the second floor, and large windows offered a view of the grounds outside. Hope surged within me. Surely we could break a window and escape. But as we approached, the view outside changed. Instead of the overgrown asylum grounds, we saw a hellish landscape of twisted trees and blood-red sky. Shapes moved in the distance, things that couldn't possibly exist in our world. "Oh God," Sarah whimpered, backing away from the window. "Where are we?" I had a sinking feeling that we were no longer in our own reality. Somehow, the asylum had transported us to somewhere else, somewhere nightmares called home. We turned away from the windows, only to find that the lobby had changed behind our backs. Where the entrance should have been, there was now only a blank wall. The staircase had transformed into a twisting, organic-looking structure that pulsed and writhed. Mike, who had been our fearless leader at the start of this misadventure, now looked like a scared child. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "This is all my fault. I never should have." His words were cut off as the floor beneath him suddenly liquefied. He sank like a stone, his scream muffled by the churning flesh-like substance that had moments ago been solid ground. Sarah lunged for him, but Alex and I held her back, watching in horror as our friend disappeared. Now we were three. Exhaustion and terror warred within me as we continued our desperate search for escape. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Had we been in this nightmare for hours? Days, the asylum toyed with us, offering glimpses of hope. A door that looked like it might lead outside. A window that showed our own world, only to snatch them away at the last second. Sarah was the next to go. We had paused to catch our breath in what looked like an old administrative office. She leaned against a filing cabinet, and before we could react, it had enveloped her. The metal twisted and warped, becoming organic, swallowing her whole as she screamed for us to help her. Alex and I ran. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead, and still the asylum tormented us. Voices whispered from the walls, some begging for help, others cackling with malicious glee. Shadows moved at the edge of our vision, always disappearing when we turned to look. "There has to be a way out," Alex panted as we paused in yet another identical corridor. Maybe if he never finished the thought. The ceiling above him suddenly dipped down like a giant hand pressing through soft clay. Before I could even shout a warning, it had engulfed him, leaving me alone in the pulsing, breathing hallway. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by despair. This was it. I was going to die here, consumed by this impossible living building. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But then I heard it, a voice different from the mocking whispers that had been haunting us. It was faint, but unmistakable. "Wake up!" My eyes shot open. The hallway around me flickered, like a glitch in a video game. For just a second, I glimpsed past the nightmare and saw the mundane reality of an old, abandoned building. "Wake up!" The voice came again, louder this time, and suddenly I understood. This wasn't real, or at least not entirely. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when my GPS began speaking in strange, unintelligible sounds. One moment, the calm robotic voice was giving me directions, and the next, it was producing a bizarre string of guttural noises that sent a chill down my spine. I should have stopped right there, should have recognized it as a red flag. But I was exhausted, frustrated, and far more disoriented than I cared to admit. So, I kept going deeper into the maze of back roads that seemed to be swallowing me whole. It wasn't until my phone died and the last bit of daylight slipped away that I realized just how precarious my situation was. My name is Sarah, and I've always been known for my excellent sense of direction. I'm the one my friends call when they're lost, the person who can navigate a city without a map. So when I chose to take a shortcut on my way to visit my sister, I didn't hesitate. Even as the roads narrowed and the houses grew sparse, I stayed confident. I figured I'd find my way back to the main highway soon enough. But trouble started when I encountered a fork in the road, one that wasn't listed on any map. My GPS, which had been losing its signal as I drifted further from the main roads, suddenly erupted into that unnerving stream of alien-sounding language. I frantically pressed at my phone, trying to mute the noise, but it only grew louder, more frantic. In a panic, I tossed the phone into the back seat, where it continued its eerie tirade. When it finally died, the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise had been. By now, night had fallen, and the world around me was plunging into darkness. The trees seemed to close in around the road, their twisted branches stretching out like clawed hands. I flicked on my headlights, but they seemed feeble against the vast emptiness. I drove on, hoping to stumble across a town, a gas station, anything that could offer directions. But the road just kept twisting and turning, leading me deeper into nowhere. The smooth pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt. Still, I pushed on, a mix of fear and stubbornness driving me forward. It wasn't long before the engine sputtered and died, stranding me in the middle of a road that felt like a dark tunnel through the woods. I sat in the silence for a long while, listening to the cooling engine and my own panicked breaths. I had to do something. I couldn't stay there. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The silence was deafening. There were no distant car engines, no barking dogs, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. It felt as if the world had been muffled, wrapped in a thick shroud of stillness. I aimed my flashlight down the road in both directions, hoping for any sign of civilization, but the beam was quickly swallowed by the dark, illuminating only a few feet ahead of me. With no better choice, I started walking in the direction I had been driving. The dirt road beneath my feet felt soft, almost sponge-like. I tried not to think about what might be making it feel that way. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that oppressive darkness. But eventually, I saw a light in the distance. Hope surged within me. Civilization at last. As I drew closer, I realized it wasn't the warm glow of a house or street light. It was a single, bare bulb, swinging gently from a post at a crossroads. The light it cast was harsh and cold, creating more shadows than it vanished. I approached cautiously, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. As I reached the edge of the light's influence, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, nailed to the post, was a sign, but it wasn't giving directions or marking a town limit. No, this sign bore a single word, crudely painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Choose. I stood there, frozen, staring at that ominous message. Choose what, and what would happen if I chose wrong. That's when I noticed them. In each direction, leading away from the crossroads, there was a path. But these weren't roads. Not really. They were different. To my left, a path of bones stretched out into the darkness. They clattered softly, though there was no wind to move them. To my right, a trail of mist hovered just above the ground, swirling and coiling like a living thing. Straight ahead, the dirt road continued, but now it pulsed faintly, as if alive. And behind me, the way I'd come was now a river of shadows, flowing like water, but darker than the night around it. I felt panic clawing at my throat. This couldn't be real. I must have fallen asleep at the wheel. Crashed, maybe. This was a dream, a hallucination. It had to be, but the chill night air on my skin felt real enough. The rough wood of the signpost was solid under my trembling fingers. This was happening. I don't know how long I stood there paralyzed by indecision. Each path seemed more impossible, more terrifying than the last. But I couldn't stay at the crossroads forever. I had to choose. In the end, I chose the path straight ahead. The living road. I don't know why. Maybe because it seemed the most familiar, the closest to the normal world I'd left behind. As soon as my foot touched the pulsing earth, I felt a jolt run through me. The ground seemed to ripple, reacting to my presence. And then, to my horror, it began to move. I was pulled forward, the living road carrying me along like a conveyor belt. I tried to turn back, but my feet were stuck fast. All I could do was watch as the crossroads receded into the distance, the swinging light growing smaller until it was swallowed by the night. The journey that followed was a nightmare of sensation. The road beneath me writhed and undulated, sometimes smooth as silk, other times rough and jagged. Shapes loomed out of the darkness. Twisted trees, impossible rock formations, things I couldn't begin to describe. And always, that feeling of movement, of being carried inexorably forward to an unknown destination. I lost all sense of time. Could have been hours or days. I was aware of changes, the air growing warmer, then impossibly cold, the sky above shifting through colors that had no names. At some point, I must have drifted off, or maybe I lost consciousness. Because suddenly, jarringly, it was over. I was standing on solid ground again, blinking as the sunlight hit my eyes. I was in a small clearing, surrounded by ordinary trees. In the distance, I could faintly hear the hum of traffic. A wave of relief washed over me. I had made it through whatever that had been. I began walking toward the sound of cars, my legs unsteady but still functioning. It wasn't until I reached the road, a typical paved highway, that I realized something was off. The cars looked strange, more streamlined, more futuristic than anything I'd ever seen. When I finally managed to stop one, the driver gave me a strange look, a mix of confusion and concern. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his accent unfamiliar to me. "Do you need help?" I barely managed to ask, "What year is it?" Dread filled me as I waited for his answer. When he told me, I felt the world tilt around me. Somehow, impossibly, I had traveled over 10 years into the future. Since then, I've spent countless hours trying to understand what happened. I've read up on quantum physics, parallel universes, and every fringe theory I could get my hands on. I've tried to connect with others who might have had similar experiences, though few believe my story. Sometimes I wonder if I really did make it back. Is this world, with its unfamiliar technology and altered surroundings, really mine? Or am I still on that strange road, stuck in some elaborate illusion? But mostly, I think about that crossroads, about the decisions I didn't make. What if I had taken the path through the bones, or the misty trail, or the river of shadows? Where would I be now? I might never get those answers. But one thing I know for sure, I'll never take a shortcut again. Sometimes the longer route is the safer choice. And if you ever find yourself on a dark, unfamiliar road, with your GPS speaking in strange tongues and your phone dying, turn back before it's too late. The fog rolled in like something alive. Tendrils of mist crept across our lawn, engulfing the house in a ghostly white veil. At first, we thought nothing of it, just an unusually dense morning fog. But as hours turned into days, and the mist showed no signs of lifting, an unsettling realization began to settle in. This was no ordinary fog. It was alive, sentient, and it was slowly creeping closer, bringing with it unspeakable horrors beyond anything we could imagine. I'm Tom Sullivan, and until a week ago, my life was as normal as could be. I lived with my wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids, Emily and Max, in a quiet suburban home. We were your typical American family, weekend barbecues, movie nights, and the occasional argument over whose turn it was to do the dishes. Nothing could have prepared us for the nightmare that awaited us. It began on a Tuesday morning. I remember it well because I was running late for work, grumbling under my breath as I fumbled with my tie. Sarah called out from the kitchen, "Tom, come look at this fog. It's so thick, I can barely see the driveway." I glanced out the window, and sure enough, a dense white mist had settled over our neighborhood. It was unusual, but not alarming. I kissed Sarah goodbye, told the kids to be good, and headed out to my car. But as I opened the front door, the fog seemed to shift, recoiling slightly before surging forward again. I paused, a cold shiver running down my spine. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw shapes moving within the mist, twisted, elongated forms that vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, I got in my car and drove to work. The fog seemed to thin as I drove further from our neighborhood, and by the time I reached the office, the day was bright and clear. But when I returned home that evening, the fog was still there, thicker than ever. Our house sat like an island in a sea of white, the mist creeping up to the edges of our property like waves crashing on the shore. Sarah met me at the door, her face pale with worry. "It hasn't lifted all day," she said. "And Tom, I think I saw something out there." We tried to keep things normal over dinner for the kids' sake, but I could see the unease in Sarah's eyes, matching my own growing sense of dread. After putting Emily and Max to bed, Sarah and I sat in the living room, watching the fog press against the windows. "We should leave," Sarah said suddenly. "We can pack up the kids and stay with my sister until this passes." I nodded, relieved that she had spoken the words I was too afraid to voice. "First thing in the morning," I agreed. But morning never came. We woke to darkness. The fog was so thick it had swallowed the sun. Our phones had no signal, the TV only static. When I tried to start the car, the engine sputtered and died, as if smothered by the mist. That's when the whispering started. At first, it was so faint we thought we were imagining it. But as the day wore on, it grew louder, more insistent. Voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in languages we didn't understand, occasionally broken by sounds that might have been laughter or screams. The kids were terrified. We huddled together in the living room, telling stories and playing games, trying to pretend everything was normal. But we couldn't ignore the shadows that moved past our windows, the scratching sounds on the roof and walls. On the third day, we saw them for the first time. Emily was the first to spot it. "Daddy," she whispered, pointing at the window. "There's a man out there." I looked where she was pointing and felt my blood turn to ice. It wasn't a man. Not really. It was vaguely humanoid, but too tall, too thin, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Its face, if you could call it that, was a swirling mass of fog with two pinpricks of light where eyes should be. As we watched, frozen in horror, more shapes emerged from the mist. Some were like the first twisted parodies of human form. Others were different, bulbous, tentacled things that slithered across our lawn, winged creatures that flitted through the fog, their shrieks sending shivers down our spines. "We need to block the windows," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm to my own ears. "Board them up now." We worked feverishly, using anything we could find. Bookshelves, dressers, planks torn from the deck outside. All the while, the entities in the fog watched us, their not quite faces pressed against the glass. For days, we huddled in our boarded-up house, rationing our dwindling food supplies, jumping at every creak and groan. The whispering never stopped, growing louder and more frantic with each passing hour. On the fifth day, they tried to get in. It started with gentle taps, like raindrops on the roof, then scratching, clawing sounds from every direction. The boards over the windows shuddered under impacts from things we couldn't see. We retreated to the basement, barricading the door behind us. Sarah held the kids close, singing softly to drown out the sounds of our home being torn apart above us. I don't know how long we stayed down there. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness. But eventually the noises stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by our ragged breathing. After what felt like hours, I gathered the courage to check upstairs. Sarah begged me not to go, but we both knew we couldn't stay in the basement forever. I crept up the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. But when I opened the basement door, I found nothing. The house was intact, exactly as it had been. The boards still covered the windows, untouched. There was no sign of the violent intrusion we had heard. Confused and cautious, I made my way to the front door. With trembling hands, I removed the barricade and turned the knob. The fog was gone. Sunlight poured down on our quiet suburban street. Birds chirped in the trees, and the distant hum of a lawnmower drifted through the air. It was as if the past week had never happened. Calling to Sarah that it was safe, I stepped outside, blinking against the bright light. Our neighbors were outside too, looking just as dazed and confused as I felt. "Some fog," Mr. Johnson from next door called out, trying to sound casual, though the tremor in his voice was undeniable. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, because even though everything appeared normal, I felt it. A shift in the air, in the very essence of reality. The fog had receded, but it hadn't vanished completely. It had seeped into our world, thinning the barrier between what we knew and what lay just beyond. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers. We tried to return to our normal lives. Sarah and I went back to work, the kids went to school. We never spoke of what happened, not even to each other. It was easier to pretend it had all been some shared delusion, some mass hallucination triggered by bad water or a gas leak. But we all knew the truth. We had glimpsed something we were never meant to see, and it had changed us forever. Now, I'm always on edge, watching the horizon for any sign of mist. I've started stockpiling supplies in the basement, food, water, weapons, just in case. Because deep down, I know it's not over. The fog will come back. And next time, boarding up our windows may not be enough to keep the horrors out. So if you ever wake up to find your world enveloped in an unnatural mist, don't brush it off as a strange weather pattern. Listen for the whispers, watch for shapes moving just out of sight, and whatever you do, don't let them in. Because once the fog has touched you, you'll never truly be rid of it. It's always waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to roll in and reclaim what it thinks belongs to it. And in those quiet moments between sleep and waking, when everything feels soft and unreal, I sometimes wonder, did the fog ever really leave? Or are we still trapped in that mist-shrouded nightmare, living out a comforting illusion while the true horrors hover just beyond our awareness, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves once more? In the late 90s and early 2000s, I worked as a maintenance custodian for both a school and a church, which were located on the same campus. The campus included the chapel, offices, kitchen, and a multipurpose room used for dinners, events, and more. The school itself was brand new at the time, and it was connected to a building that had a set of stairs leading up to the gym and another set going down to the school cafeteria. The cafeteria had a kitchen, and just outside it, a hallway wrapped around with doors leading to various rooms, including locker rooms, bathrooms, and another staircase with a pop machine next to it, which led upstairs. This detail will become relevant in a moment. Going up those stairs, you'd reach an area outside the gym. There was a foyer with one exit leading outside, and the other led to a ramp leading into the school. Both doors to the gym were secured with lockable gates to close off sections of the building when needed. I worked the second shift at the school, which sometimes extended past midnight. It wasn't unusual for teachers to come and go at all hours of the night, preparing for the next school day. One evening, I was coming off the elevator into the main hallway to take out the trash. This hallway had doors at each end, leading to stairwells, as well as doors that led to the outside. As I stepped off the elevator, I heard the door to the stairwell that led outside close behind me. I went to take the trash out through the hall door, which led into the stairwell and eventually outside. I was in the stairwell and heard someone running up the stairs. I didn't think too much of it because, like I stated earlier, this was not uncommon for teachers to come in late. It wasn't until I got outside and dumped my trash bag into the dumpster that I realized the stairwell light had been off and that there were no cars in the parking lot. Immediately, I got chills and my skin reacted with goosebumps. It did cross my mind that maybe someone got dropped off, but thought that that would be a strange thing for someone to do at midnight. I went inside and searched the 4-floor building inside and out, and no one was in the building. My heart had been beating hard the entire time, and I was truly creeped out the rest of my shift. And that unsettling feeling followed me home. Fast forward 2 weeks later, and I was doing my nightly rounds of checking doors, gates, making sure everything was secure before I left for the night. This particular night, I was downstairs by the cafeteria and ready to go upstairs on the other side when I heard the cafeteria's kitchen door slam. Now, I know it was the kitchen door because when you work at a place long enough, you tend to know the sounds everything makes. I froze in my tracks and got chills. I said hello and didn't hear anything, but also didn't want to stick around long enough as the events of 2 weeks before were still somewhat fresh in my head. I was pretty scared at that moment, ran upstairs, walked the other gate, and ended my night. I'm writing this in hopes of sharing my experiences without being judged. I know not everyone will believe me, and I'm prepared for that. However, I also know there are others out there who can relate but remain silent. So, I'm starting with my first journal entries. I'm aware that we live in a world full of skeptics, ready to dismiss my experiences as the result of a wild imagination. I've spent 32 years documenting unexplained events, entities, feelings, and the judgment I've faced. In the beginning, I wanted to prove skeptics wrong. But now, I simply want them to be open to the idea that the world isn't just black and white. There's so much gray, and while it can be terrifying at times, it has the power to completely shift one's perspective. I long to find a group of like-minded individuals who live in and see the grayness of the world. At one point in my life, I was very vocal about my experiences. I didn't fear people thinking I was crazy, and I was determined to change skeptics' minds. I didn't understand how or why someone could remain so doubtful when my reality was so different. My earliest memories as a child involved an imaginary friend. At the time, it felt normal to me, but looking back now, I realized that what I experienced wasn't normal at all. I had a so-called sixth sense and was incredibly sensitive to things that others couldn't perceive. I've encountered things that most people only experience in fictional horror movies, but for me, it was my reality. As I mentioned, even as a child, I would see different entities around the house. My parents dismissed it as just my imagination, but what I saw was real. We lived in an old house with an additional guest house attached, which we used solely for storage. There were never any tenants. My father was an auctioneer, always bringing home old antiques. One day, he brought home a green recliner to place in my room so my mother could read to me at night. However, an older gentleman with a black beard and hat occupied the chair every night after my mother would leave. He would just sit there, appearing more as a silhouette or shadow. He never spoke and he never moved. He just sat there and watched me. I strongly believed fear is not something someone is born with, but instead comes from experiences. This figure terrified me because even as a child I knew he was not supposed to be there, and I couldn't understand why my parents couldn't see him. I wish he was the only entity in my house, but he wasn't. There was a long hallway that separated my room from the guest bedroom and the stairs. I would always see a shadow figure walking this hallway and going into the guest room. It wasn't the man in the chair. This thing was much scarier. Its energy was strong and extremely negative. The feeling that I spoke about earlier originated in this hallway. Whether it was visible or not, I always knew it was around. I would run from the stairs to my room every single day. The entity then began to move around the house. I think one of the more terrifying things that happened was when I was around 10. I was getting ready in front of a mirror hanging on the bathroom door. There was a belt on the ground next to me, partially under the door. I remember vividly looking in the mirror and seeing the belt slowly slide farther under the door. Thinking I was being pranked, I opened the bathroom door and no one was there. However, the belt was now on the bathroom floor. Not only was the house leaving me in a constant state of fear and anxiety, but the guest house was a place I physically could not go into because of the dreadful feeling it gave. The few times I did go into the guest house, I would always feel like I was going to get sick and would immediately leave. The guest house was a small house with a large attic. There was a big window in the attic that looked over the entire property. One afternoon, I was jumping on the trampoline with my friends. I believe this is the epiphany moment in my life when I realized I was not the only person experiencing these things. My friend looked up at the window with a terrified look on his face. There was a woman dressed in white looking down at us. She had long blonde hair and had a very blank expression on her face. We watched her for a few minutes and then she disappeared. The house was empty and the stairs to the attic had not been used in years. This lady didn't simply walk away from the window. She completely vanished. I had 3 friends that day that witnessed this entity disappearing into thin air. This was a validation to me that I was not crazy and that there are things in this world that cannot be explained. I lived in that house until I was 12 years old. The level of activity increased throughout the years to the point to begin documenting them in a journal. I have specific details of each and far too many just to write here. When I moved to our new house built specifically for my family, I thought things would stop and I could be a normal kid, but I was wrong. So wrong. This took place about a year ago when we were living in a townhouse in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was generally safe, though there had been a few robberies a few blocks away. Still, I felt secure walking home by myself at night. That weekend, my boyfriend's brother, Marshall, and his girlfriend, Amy, along with Amy's brother, Curtis, came to visit. We planned to just hang out, have some drinks, play video games, and relax. My boyfriend was preparing for his LSATs, and after months of studying, he wanted a break before the big test. Unfortunately, I came down with a terrible flu. It was the worst I'd ever had: high fever, nausea, headache, body aches, the works. I didn't want to ruin the fun for everyone, so they came over anyway, and I stayed in my room, feeling miserable. They went out to grab dinner before coming back, so I was alone in bed, watching TV. I honestly felt like I was dying, drifting in and out of sleep. Around 4 p.m., I heard the door open and assumed they were back. I called out for my boyfriend, but no one responded. He probably didn't hear me, but I knew he'd check on me as soon as he got back. I figured I must have just heard something fall, or maybe it was just noise from the neighbors. I brushed it off and went back to sleep. I was on my back, deep in sleep, when I groggily opened my eyes and thought I saw something move across the room. I was so sick and heavily medicated that I didn't quite grasp what I was seeing. It registered that I saw something, but it didn't connect that it could be a person. The room was dark, and part of me wondered if it was just the light from the TV. Eventually, around 7 p.m., everyone came back, laughing and talking loudly. Amy, Marshall's girlfriend, was tipsy and always a blast when she'd had a few drinks. My boyfriend came in to check on me, just like I'd expected, bringing me some soup. He sat with me, talking about his day while I ate. I asked him to grab the new bottle of aspirin from the basket under the bed. We had a full-size bed, and there was a small basket under it where I kept extra medications, toiletries, and things like that. At the time, I didn't realize it, but I'm so glad he checked. He handed me the aspirin, but his face was completely drained of color. I didn't think much of it and thanked him. "Come on, I'm going to take you to the bathroom," he said. I could tell he was stumbling over his words, which was unusual for him. I was too out of it to fully process it, but I did notice. I told him, "No, I really didn't have to pee, and I didn't feel like getting up." And then he said, "No, let's go. I don't want to have to climb back up the stairs just because you need to pee in 10 minutes. I remember feeling pretty hurt by his words, but I knew that he was right since I just had soup and a bottle of water. He walked me downstairs, and I couldn't understand why we didn't go to the bathroom upstairs. I think I was so sick, I just felt too exhausted to question it. He sat me down on the couch. "What's going on?" He took out his phone, and his hand was shaking. I asked what was wrong, and I will never forget how my heart sunk and I felt like I couldn't breathe when he whispered, "There was someone under the bed." Amy laughed, so I laughed thinking it was a prank, but it felt serious. My boyfriend's brother suggested we get out of the house, so we did. And as we were leaving, we heard a thud upstairs. We quickly left and drove away and then called the police. The police came and searched the house, but they didn't find anyone. He must have known that we suspected that he was there and then left. My boyfriend couldn't give any description, only that he saw some sneakers, but it was so dark, he didn't see a face or anything else. The scariest thing that still leaves me on edge is that the police found a knife under the bed. It was a small steak knife, very dull and rusty. There weren't any killings in the area, so my friends assumed that he just wanted a place to sleep. I'm not really sure how he got into our place, but I have some theories. I'm really proud of how my boyfriend handled everything. He's a calm and collected person, but I always assumed he wouldn't be that way in a crisis. I really hope that this person doesn't come around again. The first time I saw a shadow person was when I was about 11 years old, on a camping trip with my cousins. It was early in the morning, and everyone was still asleep except for me. I was staring at the side of the tent when I noticed a clear outline of a boy wearing a cap standing by the tent. Unlike the normal shadows cast by the trees and other things, this one was solid black. The boy then walked back and forth in front of the tent repeatedly. We were out in the middle of nowhere, and I was scared, thinking some stranger was pacing our tent. When everyone else woke up and we went outside, there was no one there. I told my cousins what had happened, but they didn't believe me. It was like the boy followed me home because, over the next year, he would appear behind people when I was talking to them outside or walk along the fence line at random. His presence wasn't particularly creepy, aside from his random appearances outside, but it was unsettling. The last time I saw the boy was when my friend and I were having a sleepover while my mom was working. We were outside late at night, not sleeping, just messing around. We started to feel like someone was watching us. So we grabbed a flashlight and shined it around the yard and down the street. There was no one there. But when we shined the light over a power pole, we briefly saw a boy in a cap peeking out from behind the pole. Even when the light hit him, he was completely black. We shone the flashlight around the pole for a bit but didn't see anyone. So we went inside and locked the door. Nothing else happened until I was about 14, when I encountered something even more disturbing. The girl. She was much more aggressive and creepier than the boy. The first time I saw her, I was half asleep at a family friend's house. The family had doors in most of their rooms except for the makeshift guest room, where they used curtains in the doorway for privacy instead of an actual door. It was early morning, and the family friend's kids were running around making noise. I rolled onto my side and saw the shadow of a very tall girl in a dress holding the curtain open, staring at me. I was annoyed, thinking it was just one of the family's residents, so I asked, "What do you want?" And then, without warning, she vanished. The curtain flickered dramatically, as though there was a sudden breeze. I went back to sleep. A few days later, when I was sleeping again, I felt the blanket slowly being dragged down my body. I thought the blanket was just falling off the bed, so I reached out, still half asleep, and pulled it back up. But then, it aggressively whipped down to my ankles. Still groggy, I assumed the kids were messing with me, so I pulled the blanket back up, wrapped it around me like a cocoon, and held onto it tightly. But then, I could feel the blanket being tugged at relentlessly, and it felt rough, like it was being yanked from me. By this time, I was fed up and just wanted to sleep. I finally said, "Just take the blanket," then, letting go of the blanket that basically flew into the air and landed in the entry point of the room, I sat up and realized, 1, there was no one else in the room since I would have heard them. There was no signs of running or laughing from the kids. 2, the intensity of the blanket was pulled off of me, couldn't be done by a child, and was major overkill of blanket snatching. Despite not seeing anything, I was creeped out and ran down the hall into the living room where I stayed up until the rest of the night. Another encounter with the girl, and the more creepy ones, was when I was sleeping on the couch of my older sister's house. I woke up because I felt a big whoosh of air, as if someone ran at mega speed past the couch. I laid there wondering what had just happened, and then I saw the clear shadow of a tall girl in a dress run really fast past the couch. By then, I was scared, so I didn't move, and this girl was basically running laps past this couch at super speed with a whoosh every time she passed. Mind you, this was a living room, so to even pick up a speed this girl was getting at in such a short length of area was supernatural to begin with. I was getting more and more spooked, so I decided to make a leap of faith and try to dart into my sister and her significant other's room, which meant I had to pass the area where the shadow person version of the Flash was sprinting. When I moved, the girl stopped, then walked around to the other end of the couch and stared at me. I was feeling bold enough to tell her to go away, so she came closer to me. I felt around for a cushion and threw it at her, which went straight through her and didn't do anything. She then basically walked up beside me and started leaning her face towards mine. So I covered my face with a blanket, started crying, then started saying the Lord's Prayer. I didn't move, and eventually, I fell asleep until the morning. My sister told me in the morning, if I kept running around at night, I can get out of her house. The girl then would appear in the corner of my room at night at random. I slept with the night light on until I was almost 20. The worst and last encounter was her and my family home. I had a bunk bed that was a double below and single at the top. I slept on the bottom bunk. One night, I woke up to pitch black feet climbing up the ladder of the bunk bed, and the weight formed on the top bunk as if someone plopped down on it. I stared at the top bunk, not knowing what to do, when the entire bed frame started shaking and rocking as if someone was up there having a seizure. I wasn't going to check it out. Then I started hearing a really harsh and rough breathing with something that almost sounded like growling. So I just started praying because I was too scared to leave the bed. I then slept on my floor of my mother's room for several days. The final time I saw what I assumed was a shadow person was when I was about 21, and I booked a hotel room with a female cousin. We were going to an event in the city area. My cousin got trashed, and I wasn't that interested in drinking. We got back to the hotel, and my cousin went straight to sleep. My cousin was laying there sleep-talking, and I was playing on my phone. The beds were separated like typical hotel beds with a bedside cupboard in between. I looked up, and a tall shadow of a man was standing over my cousin. He simply appeared from nowhere, and I was trying to get my cousin to wake up. The man immediately whipped his head to me. Because it was a shadow, it had no facial features yet. It was staring directly at me. He then basically zoomed towards my bed, which I jumped off and switched the overhead light on, and he vanished. My cousin was too drunk to notice, and I kept the lights on all night. In 2012, my wife and I went camping a lot. That year, we spent 52 nights in the backwoods, each weekend on Vancouver Island, relishing the peace and solitude. One weekend, we found ourselves on a remote beach, far from civilization. To get to the trail that would lead us out, we had to walk a kilometer along the beach, then another 2 through the forest to reach the road. There was no one around, except for a man named Leon from New Zealand, whom we had met earlier on the beach. He was planning on staying in his van up the road, but we invited him to join us by the fire for some company and shared a bottle of wine. As we sat and talked, we kept hearing faint female voices from what sounded like the bushes behind us. At first, I figured it was just the sound of someone anchored offshore, the noise bouncing strangely off the water. We all acknowledged hearing it, but thought little of it. Leon eventually hiked back to his van, and my wife and I stoked the fire because she was starting to feel creeped out. We stayed up quite late, and by the time the voices stopped, we decided to put out the fire and get some sleep. We scanned the cove with a flashlight a few times, trying to find any boats that could be the source of the chatter. It was around 3 a.m. when we finally lay down. 15 minutes after settling in, we heard footsteps near our camp, coming from the direction of the bushes behind us. This area wasn't passable for people, so we just lay there, hoping it was a bear or something similar, since the island had black bears, but they were usually harmless if dealt with properly. The footsteps moved from the fire area toward our tent, then back into the woods. 5 minutes later, the footsteps returned to the fire, followed by 2 female voices speaking gibberish, loudly. They were talking in a full-volume discussion in the middle of the night, miles from civilization, without using lights or making any noise that would suggest they were trying to move quietly through the thick brush. They came right up to our fire pit and continued their conversation, then moved toward our tent, still speaking loudly in what sounded like gibberish. They stood over us for a few seconds, still talking, and then everything went completely silent. It was like they vanished into thin air. After a few moments, they went back into the woods, and we never heard or saw them again. We lay there, frozen, unsure of how long, just terrified. We didn't sleep much and woke up around 11 a.m. the next day after such a late night. That was the last time we camped outdoors for at least a year. Romania is a country where, sadly, stories of kidnapping, murder, and people just disappearing aren't entirely unheard of. My parents were legitimately afraid for me and strongly opposed the idea of traveling on my own. So, I had to lie to them and say we were staying in a hotel near Kosha National Park, just to get them off my back. Of course, that wasn't exactly the plan. Long story short, we had to travel from Bucharest to the park, a distance of about 200 kilometers, which took roughly 2 hours by train. We packed our huge backpacks with everything we needed and set off. Nothing too strange happened on the train itself, except for the fact that the train was crowded, except for our compartment, which was completely empty. And let me tell you, that is an extremely rare occurrence on Romanian trains. I was excited, thinking we'd have the whole compartment to ourselves. But of course, after about 10 or 20 minutes, it was filled by a man entering with a beautiful German shepherd. I'm a huge animal lover, especially when it comes to cats and dogs, and I usually get along with most animals, even the ones that aren't exactly people-friendly. But not this dog. No, this dog was different. It looked stiff, almost like a stuffed animal, and it obeyed every command its owner gave it. I was genuinely impressed. So, I struck up a conversation with the man about his dog, since it would be a long and awkward trip in complete silence. The man was eerily like his dog. He only spoke to give commands, never really contributing anything to the conversation otherwise. He told me the dog's name was Yuksai Gasol, which in Romanian means the killer. It was a strange name to give a dog, especially considering he used the English word rather than translating it into Romanian. But I thought, well, to each their own. I asked him, why such a scary name? And he replied bluntly, this dog is trained to kill. It's the only thing he likes and is good at. Now, I've always believed that dogs often grow up to reflect their owners' personalities. Most of the time, I can judge a person based on how their dog reacts to the world and to them. And let me tell you, these two didn't give off a good vibe at all. I brushed it off, thinking maybe the man was training his dog for hunting in the woods or something like that. Then I started thinking which woods are legal to hunt in our country. While I was thinking of that, the guy, out of nowhere, asks us if we are traveling to the Coesia National Park. That was surprisingly accurate considering that the only time we mentioned the place was in the train station long before we found our seats and way longer before we even met this man. Again, I thought it was nothing because in my country, people who happen to go in the same direction will try to make small talk and guess where you are heading. Of course, you can just lie to keep safe of your destination or be honest. I took the honesty route and I am judging myself for that. Never be too honest with strangers or honest at all if you listen to this story. We confirmed we are going to that place, asked what else is to see around since he started talking about the area, and well, considering we knew nothing about the place, we took it all in. He told us about the woods, the vegetation, the animals we can encounter, told us about the beautiful monastery right at the bottom of the mountain that we need to climb, advised us to visit the Loder Shore waterfall and explore the caves behind it and try out the local restaurant. When this guy started talking about the wilderness and nature, his eyes glowed as if he was experiencing a pleasant memory. But he also grabbed his dog's collar from the neck, squeezing it tight. The collar made a loud clink sound. What surprised me was that the dog made no move, no whimper, no twitch, nothing. Just like a stuffed animal. Anyway, we reach our destination, say our goodbyes. The man waves at us and we faced against him to go on our way. I turn around back right away because I wanted to ask where exactly the restaurant was, and the man and the dog were no longer there. Not just that, but also his luggage was gone. That creeped me out a bit, but who cares? We were too thrilled for our first camping experience. We start walking with our backpacks on us and reach a tunnel digging into the mountain. It looked amazing, exactly like those horror movie tunnels, which, if traveled during night, would make your hair stand straight. Lucky for me, we traveled during daytime. It wasn't a long tunnel. We could see the end, but by the time we got to the middle of it, we hear a whimper in the distance. It sounded like a dog crying in desperation for its life. We stop. My boyfriend looks at me with his, "Oh no, you're not going to take that dog with us" type of face and tries to convince me to take a different route. We don't. I hear the dog. I go right towards the sound. And in the middle of the road, I see a chubby puppy with lots of white and brown circles on his butt, crying so hard and laying on the cement looking really hurt as if hit by a car. I freeze and think to myself that our trip is over. I must save this dog. We call for him. He looks at us, pointy ears up, gets up and like a doofus starts running desperately to us. He was alone and afraid. We called him Rudolph and now he was our camping buddy. Like 1 kilometer further, we find another puppy, probably his sister, which we dragged from the nearby river, all wet, cold, and hungry. Of course, we take her too. So here we are, 10-kilogram backpacks each, 2 puppies at my chest, boyfriend with map, trying to find a spot to camp the first night. We passed by the monastery the man in the train mentioned, but because we had these puppies, we couldn't enter inside the building. The priests wouldn't allow us. So we just walk around the property, through the gardens, until we reached the base of the mountain we had to climb. I'd like to mention that these puppies were 2 tiny little brats, because the second you put them down and force them to walk on their own, they would slam their butts to the ground and cry. Such drama. We walk and walk and walk until we decide to stop because it was getting late, and I was beginning to get cold. We found a spot next to a small landmark type of cottage in the middle of the wood. We call it Troyunitsa. It's like a scouting post, but for the church, where they place religious icons or a Bible, stuff like that, inside to bring good energy to the area. It belongs to the church. It wasn't like a house. It was basically a roof with 4 small walls and an opening, not a door. You could go in to, like, hide from the rain. There was an icon inside and a Bible with pages ripped from it. Curious as I am, I opened the Bible, was really annoyed to see that people would write down their names in it, like couples do on trees. But on one particular page, the words, "I will find you," stuck out. It was written in red ink. Again, I thought to myself that it was probably someone who wanted to scare travelers with silly messages. I put the book back and gave it no second thought. We put up the tent, make the fire, unpack, make food and eat. We feed the puppies, which now are cuddled up in our tent. And finally, darkness starts to rise all around us. My boyfriend always kept the fire up every hour because when it went off, it felt as if the sounds in the woods were louder and closer to us than in reality. Now it's around 12 a.m. We are all in the tent, cuddling to keep warm. The puppies wake up and start crying. I get up and unzip the tent to put them out to pee. They do, and I get them back in. They cry some more, and the smallest one starts shivering. At the same time, I hear grunting from behind our tent. My boyfriend is up too. He hears it as well. The fire is fading. The moment he unzips the tent and steps out, the sound disappears into the woods. It sounds like a snake slithering through the fallen leaves on the ground, but with unimaginable speed. I ask him, was that a snake? He says up to this day that he cannot explain what he saw. He says it was a slithery figure with feet that made a snort-like sound when the light hit it. The puppies calm back down after this creature disappears into the woods. We try to go back to sleep after we reignite the fire. It's 3 a.m. by this time, and we wake up to the puppies being fussy again. The fire is nearly dead. My boyfriend gets up to search for firewood, and I get out as well. I stare into the darkness, and I swear, I hear whispers coming from between the trees. I look up at the sky, consider it's 3 a.m., and hear birds being very loud and fluttering their wings. Now, I'm no expert in birds, but don't they usually sleep around this time? Well, these weren't. They were very active, very vocal, and very frustrated. I look at the fire and follow the red sparks popping out of it into the sky and become fascinated with something. The spark doesn't seem to die. It goes on, changing color from hellish red to green. This was very out of the ordinary for me because it created an illusion hard to explain. It looked as if the fire sparks were going into the woods, creating a track for me, probably to follow. I kept looking after each spark to see when it burns out. None of them did. They would levitate, turn green, and flow into the woods. At that moment, I began to get goosebumps on my skin. The birds being agitated, the mysterious light pointing us to go deeper into the woods, and all the trees around us have eyes on them. The trunks had a distinguished shape that looked exactly like eyes. I know this is nothing paranormal since someone explained that those shapes form when a branch is ripped from the root, and that's the shape that is left over. But there were way too many, like 100 eyes all looking at the exact spot we were camping, having only that religious tiny landmark to mentally protect us. And as I inspect my surroundings, I hear movement in one of the bushes in front of our tent, like 10 meters away from us. Obviously, I stand my ground but don't go near it. Suddenly, a dark bent-over silhouette comes out of it and, half inside the bush and half outside, stares at us. I call my boyfriend and we are both like, what the heck is that? Is it a bear cub? A wolf? A pig? The creature shakes its head the same way a dog does after a bath, and I hear a distinguished clink like a dog collar. At this time, my boyfriend manages to light up the fire really big, which scares this animal to run back into the woods through the bush from which it initially came out of. That calms us down, but not enough to ever close our eyes again during that night. Going back into the tent, my boyfriend falls asleep. The puppies are sound asleep, but not me. I keep the zipper on the tent opened a little, just enough to have my eye peek through it right at the early mentioned bush. I think I spent a solid hour staring and falling asleep to that bush. All of a sudden, I hear a noise coming from that direction and I immediately wake my boyfriend up, who is now peeking through the hole in complete darkness with me. What we see next still haunts my dreams. From that exact same bush, we see a human head popping out and looking towards our tent. Note that our peeping hole was small enough to not make it look like you were being watched from the inside of the tent. This head is slowly coming out of the bush, skin so white, we thought it was a ghost. After that, a shoulder, another shoulder, a full torso, a leg, bit by bit, an entire man emerges from the bush, completely naked, lighted by both the moon and our fire. What he did next was excruciatingly scary for me. He comes so close to our tent and begins to remove branches, rocks, etc. from our fire, basically extinguishing our fire by dismantling it. This all happening like 2 or 3 meters from our tent. I look at the man with horror because I recognize him, and now the clink I heard earlier from that animal is explained. It is the same man from the train with his dog too. I'm not sure if he followed us, or if he just happened to be on the same route and decided to stalk us, but this guy was there since at least midnight. Our campfire would go out every 2 or 3 hours, and we would be woken up by the sounds of branches cracking and rocks shifting. At first, we tried to explain it away as animals crossing through the area. But after a while, we realized something wasn't right. He managed to put out our fire at least once. Afterward, he slowly crept back into the same bush where we had seen him earlier. He submerged into it bit by bit until only his head was visible, and his mouth looked twisted and disfigured, almost like a moaning ghost. It's hard to describe how terrifying that was. After seeing that, you try to go back to sleep, but you can't. We didn't know what to do. We got back up, reignited the fire, lit some torches, and stayed near the campfire until the first rays of dawn. I'll admit, I did fall asleep while sitting next to the fire, and my boyfriend did too. But any little sound would wake us up. I was too afraid to go near that bush. I didn't need any answers or explanations. I just wanted daylight so we could get the heck out of there. And we did. We packed up our stuff and left. We had planned a 4-day camping trip, but after that first night, we couldn't continue. It was a risk we weren't willing to take. Whether that guy followed us or if it was all just a coincidence, it was enough to ruin everything. As a conclusion to my story, and as advice to first-time campers, never tell strangers your exact location or even areas near your destination. You never know where their minds might go or what they might be planning. Always stay safe, be aware of your surroundings, and notice any changes, like sounds, movements, or temperature shifts. Most importantly, always protect yourself. Here's the rewritten version. It was 2011 and I had just left the Navy. I decided to move back in with my parents on their farm in Michigan while I figured out what to do next. This was right after the 2008 market crash, and it took longer than I expected to get back on my feet. Because of that, I ended up staying with them longer than planned. My mom had grown used to having me around to help with mowing the lawn, raking leaves, and shoveling snow, so she asked me to stay a bit longer to keep helping. I agreed. Unfortunately, the farmhouse my parents owned, which had been in the family for generations, burned down. They had to move into town and rented a house. They found a nice place at a reasonable price and signed a lease. I moved in with them, but with no farm to tend to, I started looking for my own place. My mom insisted I stay, and after talking it over with my girlfriend, we decided it was best for me to stay at my parents' place and save up for the future. After a few years, we found out the landlord had heavily mortgaged the house, and it was being foreclosed. We moved again and ended up in another house, but soon the landlord decided to retire and sold the property, which meant no renewed lease. This left us looking for another place to live, and we ended up in a small house in a rough neighborhood, which didn't even have a front porch light. At this point, I was seriously considering moving out for more stability, but by then, my girlfriend had become my fiancée, and I needed to focus on saving for our wedding. So I stayed. Things were rough around that house in the bad neighborhood, and eventually, the series of unsettling events convinced my parents to buy a new house. Some of these incidents were just a result of living in a bad area. For instance, a house down the street was raided multiple times in the year we lived there because it was operating a brothel. A nearby church was robbed several times. A house was set on fire by an arsonist. A woman was dragged out of her house by the sheriff after being reported for not paying rent. A guy across the street was arrested almost every week for domestic violence. Another house up the street was raided a couple of times for drug dealing. There was constant chaos on that street, but none of these things were the real reason my parents decided to move. Here's what happened next. After we moved into the new place, my parents went out one evening to spend time with friends, and I was at home talking to my fiancée over Skype since she was in Ireland at the time. It was a warm September evening, and the house didn't have air conditioning, so I had the front door open with the screen door closed and my bedroom door open to stay cool. From where I was sitting at my PC in my bedroom, I could clearly see the front door. As I was talking to my fiancée, I heard what sounded like the latch on the front screen door. I looked toward the door, but saw nothing. Assuming it was the wind rattling the screen door, I continued my conversation. Then, I heard it again and I watched the door for a moment to see if I could see the branches of the trees or the leaves blowing and swaying in the wind. There was no wind, so when I heard the latch jiggling a third time, I got up and went to investigate. And as I walked outside, there was a man walking off the side of the porch and away from the house. I called after him asking if there was something he needed, but he ignored me completely. As this was happening, my parents were arriving home and saw the man crossing our driveway at an angle that made it obvious he had been on our porch, with me standing on the porch calling after him. He walked into the neighbor's house and disappeared from sight. My dad turned to me and asked, "What's happening? What did the guy want?" I proceeded to tell him about how I kept hearing the latch on the screen door, and when I attempted to investigate, I found this guy on our porch and bailing as quickly as possible. And when I asked what he needed, he ignored me and ran off. My dad then walked over to the neighbors to ask about the odd behavior. He wouldn't come to the door at first, but when he finally did, he claimed he was just looking to bum some cigarettes. My dad handed him a few, then asked why he hadn't just knocked, and if he needed cigarettes, why did he run when asked what he wanted? I should note here that my dad had accidentally left an almost full pack on his porch chair, and it hadn't been bothered. So naturally, we didn't believe him, and instead of answering my dad's questions, he just ran off into the house somewhere. My dad then found himself talking to an older couple and found out through the old couple that they owned the house next door, and that the weird guy was their son who had just gotten out of prison for theft-related crimes. He got caught about 6 weeks later breaking into another neighbor's house. The homeowner called the cops, and he was found to have violated his parole and was sent back to jail. But that's not the end of the story. Shortly after, the man next door tried to sneak into the house while I was still there. We started having an issue where someone had tried to get into the back door. We would come home from grocery shopping or something and the back gate would be open and the screen door on the back door would be swinging in the breeze. This went on for a while until one day we came home, found the back gate open again. And when we went to close the back screen door, there were tool marks on the door jamb, like someone had been trying to jimmy the door open. We found a small pry bar in the tall grass next to the back porch, and we realized that the only reason to leave it there was if the culprit had dropped it while running away as quickly as possible. Say, for example, if he needed to beat a hasty retreat over the back fence as the residents pulled up. At this point, my dad had had enough of the guy who had been next door, whoever was trying to get in through the back door. And so, he decided some cameras would be useful and started to price things. He ended up getting some trail cams that could be plugged in to recharge or motion activated as trail cams usually are and could be easily mounted. He put one up facing towards the back door where the camera could see through the window in the back door. And he mounted the other where it could see out the front door. These cameras were about to prove they were worth it. We had been in the place a few months now and it was early March, and we had had snow overnight. I awoke to find 4 inches in the driveway, so I shoveled the snow out of the driveway real quick before heading off to work. My dad woke up about an hour later and also left for work, leaving my mother home alone. According to her, sometime during mid-morning, she was surprised by a knock at the door. And when she answered, there was a man there, stocky, around 57 with a goatee, offering snow removal services. My mother looked at the driveway and found it devoid of snow. When she looked back at the guy, he looked like he was trying to peer around her into the house. She shut him down, telling him that she clearly didn't need snow removal and closed the door in his face. As she did, She heard him kick the screen door as if he was attempting to put his foot in the door, as he insisted that he could do snow removal for just a nominal fee. She ignored him and he eventually wandered off. She told me and my dad about it later, but there just wasn't much to the story. Some idiot offered snow removal to people who didn't need it. Not exactly the Amityville horror, so we kind of just brushed it off. A few weeks later, in early April, my parents went on a cruise for my mother's birthday, leaving me alone in the house. I had been in the house alone for a few days when some guy showed up at around 8:30 p.m., pitch black night outside, saying that he was from the gas company that provided our gas company with natural gas, and he needed to come in and see our gas bills to make sure we were not being overcharged. I was immediately wary of the man as he matched the description my mother had given me about the snow removal guy a month earlier, and it was 8:30 p.m. The gas company closed at 5. It was possible people would be doing overtime, but for 3.5 hours after closing, going door to door in the cold Michigan spring, it seemed unlikely. He was wearing an ID on a lanyard around his neck, but he kept his hands over the actual ID, and he flashed it at me so fast that I couldn't really see it. To be honest, what I did see looked like that back of a Topps baseball card with the player stats. Then he actually tried to push past me into the house, but I put my hand on his shoulder and pushed him back while telling him no at the same time. He insisted that he was just making sure that we weren't being cheated, and then pointed to the only other house on the street with no front porch light and said he had just come from over there and that he had managed to cut over 10% of their gas bills. I cut him off and told him that not only was it late, but it did not go over my head. That his best and only example of his work was the only other poorly lit house with no front porch light. That I found it very suspicious that he actually expected me to show him private financial information on the gas bill, nor did I believe the gas company would have people out so late. I told him he needed to leave, and he responded by trying to push past me again, telling me it was fine and he was just there to help. I pushed him back again, more aggressively this time, and almost pushed him backward off the porch, firmly telling him no. I wasn't going to show him anything, and that he needed to leave now. I told him that it was not okay that he repeatedly tried to enter the home without permission, nor was it fine that he repeatedly demanded to see private financial information. Then I looked him in the eyes and as confidently as possible told him that this intrusion felt more to me like he was casing the house for a burglary, and I would be calling the cops immediately after closing the door. And then I warned him that I was former military and that I was armed, and that if I saw him around my house again, that I would act accordingly. Now I am not a psycho. I had no real want to hurt anybody, but I needed him to know that I had the means, capability, and willingness to defend myself in the home, if necessary. He slowly walked off the porch as I closed the door, and he started down the street. I watched him through the windows walk right past all the well-lit houses of my neighbors. As he walked away, it occurred to me that he should have some sort of company vehicle. If he really was from the gas company as he claimed, there should be some sort of service truck or company car with a logo or rental tags. So I went out onto the front porch and looked up and down the street to find one. There was nothing. However, as I looked back toward him, he was signaling at someone who came from behind some bushes on a side street near the house, literally less than 10 yards away. The guy was taller and skinnier than his friend, like sickly and frail skinny, but somehow he still had an aura of danger about him. The first guy made me feel slightly uneasy, but this guy made me feel chilled to the core. And he wore an oversized hooded sweater that in the darkness completely hid his facial features, giving him a look like the Grim Reaper. He kept pointing at the house, and his body language kept getting more and more forceful. I could tell he wanted to come back to the house for whatever reason, but the first guy didn't, and I couldn't help but wonder what their plan was that the accomplice wanted so much to complete. What would have happened if I had actually let this guy into the house? At this point, I followed through with my promise and pulled out my phone and called the police non-emergency line and reported him. I was on the phone with the officer taking my statement when the fake gas guy and his friend turned and started pointing at the house. That's when they realized I was still watching them from the porch, and the first guy began to run down the street. However, his accomplice just stood and looked in my direction as I spoke to the officer. I don't know how I know this, as I couldn't see his face with that giant hood up in the dark of the night, but I could tell he was staring at me. And as I watched him, I realized I couldn't look away from him. I felt like I just entered a battle of wills, and if I looked away, it would end badly for me. So I just stood there and watched him with chills dancing up and down my spine. After what felt like a small eternity, but what had to have been only several seconds of this staring contest, he looked away slowly and nonchalantly made his way back down the street to catch up with the fake gas guy. I realized I had been holding my breath and let out a long sigh. The officer was asking me if I was still on the line, and it occurred to me that I had just dropped off mid-conversation with the person on the other end. My knees felt weak, and I needed to sit down. So I went inside and locked the door. The police promised to send a patrolman around and take a look for anything suspicious and told me to call back if they came back. I hung up the phone. I was alone in a bad neighborhood with a couple of random guys casing the house, one of which was clearly not right in the head. I went to bed with my weapon on my desk, ready to go just in case. I was woken up from a fitful sleep by my phone a couple hours later. The patrolman had caught the guys pulling the same stick at another house with no porch light down the street. The creepy one was hiding around the corner of the house when the patrol car pulled up. I had to go in the next day to confirm they were the same people. While I never got a clear look at the accomplice's face, I was able to identify the person who knocked on my door. I read up on them in the paper a little while later. Apparently, they were looking for victims to rob, or so they claimed. The accomplice apparently had several large knives on him when he was arrested, hidden underneath his giant hoodie, leading police to believe he, at least, had other plans than just burglary. When confronted with these questions, they took plea deals in exchange for confessions. The one with the knives got his parole revoked and found himself back in jail with an extra couple years tacked onto his original sentence. The door knocker got 30 days in the county jail, 100 days community service, $1,000 fine, and 1 year probation. When my parents got back from their cruise, I told them what happened, and my mother rushed over to the trail cams. She found early March and the pictures of the snow removal guy, and then went to the next day in question and found pictures of the gas company guy. They were the same guy, near as we can figure, because my dad and I worked long hours and were typically gone most of the day. The only person they had ever seen leaving and entering the house was my mother, who was a tiny old lady, so they assumed she lived alone. Here's the rewritten version. A couple of weeks later, he showed up late at night, but instead of finding a lonely old lady, he encountered a 63-year-old military vet who firmly told him, "No, you're not coming in." That completely messed up whatever they had planned. I'll tell you though, there was something about the accomplice that unsettled me. Maybe it was because he had been hiding in the bushes the entire time while his friend and I were talking, or maybe it was the fact that his face was obscured by a large hood. But before he even noticed me standing there, I could feel the danger radiating from him, like alarm bells going off in my mind. It was as if he absolutely despised me, simply for existing, and he wanted me to suffer for it. The way he glared at me from beneath the dark shadows of his hood was almost unnatural. I ended up taking some time off work, drained a bit of my savings, and went to Europe to visit my fiancée. I just needed to escape that house for a while. While I was away, my parents quickly found a new house on the outskirts of town, far from any bad neighborhoods, and moved in. When I returned from my trip, I asked them why they'd bought a house so suddenly. They simply told me they never wanted to rent again after the experience in that house. In Central California, there's an old mining community you might have heard of called the Motherlode. This area played a significant role in the California Gold Rush, and it's the setting for this story. As you head out of town, there's a long road that stretches like a highway, but suddenly you veer right onto a rough, older road, less than a quarter-mile down. The road eventually dead ends into a circular parking area with a gate at the far end, which the city keeps locked. If you manage to get past the gate, you'd end up at a popular lake nearby. When you park at the end of the road, you're surrounded on one side by steep hills covered in poison oak and tall pine and oak trees. On the other side, there's a sharp downhill slope leading to the lake. So essentially, you're in a bowl. We had heard that if we went up the hill to the left, there was an old mine, abandoned long ago by the miners, that the county had never closed. About 250 feet up the hill, we came across the mine, nearly hidden in a slight dip in the hillside that would be hard to spot unless you were right on top of it. To get into the mine, we had to climb down a small slope and navigate over some medium-sized rocks that had been left behind after the miners blasted into the mountain. The mine itself was about 7 feet tall and 6 feet wide, forming a tunnel that extended about 250 feet into the mountain. The walls were rough and rocky, with a colorful vein running along the left side. This vein was said to signal the presence of gold, marked by its ribbons of various colors. The tunnel followed that vein, taking 2 sharp turns with a couple of short dead-end offshoots along the way. As we ventured deeper into the mine, we had to step carefully to avoid the mud that had accumulated. The old or cart tracks, which had once hauled rocks out of the mine, were still there, helping us navigate. Inside the mine, it was completely dark and silent except for the sound of the wind howling and the occasional dripping water. We took our time exploring the dark tunnel until we reached the end, which was a solid rock wall. Disappointed, we started heading back toward the entrance. My friend, however, decided to stop near the entrance to chip off a sample of the rock from the vein in the wall. He promised he'd be quick, so I just stood there and waited for him. I maybe stood there for a couple of minutes before I heard the first strange sound. It sounded like a small pile of rocks toppling over, echoing up the shaft towards us. I tried to tell my buddy what I just heard, but he didn't hear me, so I just let it go. Not even 2 minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. This time I got his attention to tell him what I just heard, but he just thought I was being paranoid. He said, "You're just hearing an echo from me." I tried to take his word for it, but again, not even 2 minutes later, there it was again. That time the sound came with a feeling of panic and fear. That was when I literally just said, "You only have to be faster than your slowest friend." Then I just took off running over the rocks and out of the mine. When he came out a few minutes later, he said he walked back to the end and didn't see any fallen rocks. I didn't go back there until a few years later with another buddy of mine. Same as before, up the steep hill we went. The mine looked exactly as it did before, front to back with no signs of a cave-in. Just as my other buddy had done before, my buddy just had to stop on the way out to chip away at that vein winding along the left wall. As I was standing there waiting, I heard another strange, scary sound. But that time, it sounded like a rattle and we both heard it. The only way we could describe it was it sounded just like a baby rattle. We both froze and looked at each other, puzzled and anxious, illuminated in each other's headlamps. Not even a couple minutes later, we both heard it again, the sound of a baby rattle. We both grew up here, so we knew it wasn't a rattlesnake or anything, which are common here. When we heard it the third time, the creepy feeling came right back to me and I just ran out of there as fast as I could, practically tripping on the rocks on the way out. I haven't gone back since. I can't describe it. Something about that old mine just came with a bad, scary feeling, and both people that went there with me felt it as well. I wasn't as scared as I probably should have been, but then again, my fear instinct isn't very strong and I'd been drinking. There's a lake less than an hour from home, and my daughter's friend had never been camping before, so we thought we'd do a quick overnight trip. It was just me and my daughter. We camp a lot and enjoy the solitude, so we often seek out the most remote spots. We didn't bother with a campsite, we just drive up and find a good spot. This time, we found a nice little peninsula that was big enough for about 3 campsites. Since it was Sunday, we were hoping the other 2 groups would pack up and leave, and they eventually did, leaving us with the place pretty much to ourselves. The night went on perfectly. Good fire, singing, laughing, I was drinking some wine, and we were making s'mores. Everything was great until we went to bed. About an hour in, the girls woke me up, saying it was raining and we needed to put the cover on the tent. It was a big tent, so we all had to pitch in. By this point, the wind was picking up, and it was a struggle, but we finally got it covered and tried to go back to sleep. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a motorcycle, or more specifically, a dirt bike. It was around 2 a.m., and we could hear it riding in circles around the peninsula. Now, keep in mind, this was a small area, just enough space for 3 large tents and 3 cars, and nothing else around us but bushes and the lake. There was no reason for anyone to be out there, especially since it was obvious we were alone. The bike kept circling, revving up and idling, and I just wanted to sleep, so I unzipped the front of the tent to look outside. I saw the rider just staring at the tent. So I climbed out of the tent and stared back. It was so dark, I couldn't even tell if he could see me. Frustrated, I went back inside the tent. The girls asked what he was doing, and when I told them, they became really frightened. I told them I was going to go out and give him a piece of my mind, but they were terrified and begged me not to leave the tent. I eventually settled back in, trying to ignore it. But the guy didn't stop. He kept riding in circles, revving the engine, idling over and over again. This went on for at least another hour. I've had it. Down, up, around with all that annoying, belating motocross sound blasting by our tent back and forth and stop. I look out. He's staring again. I'm about to go stomping over to go tell him off when I get the tingles all down my spine. He was facing directly towards our tent, saying nothing, just still and staring. I realize I have no weapons, no way to protect the girls, and he's between us and the car. I wait. I'm outside the tent, but I haven't made a move forward because now instinct and logic have the better of me, and I realize that an aggressive approach is probably the wrong move. I stay stock still, just like the rider, for what felt like an eternity. Both of us staring. Must have been 20 minutes I stood there. And then just like that, he took off, drove off the peninsula and out of earshot, and never came back. To this day, I'll never know what that was about or if I did the right thing. I can only say I'm glad I never confronted him. My gut just told me no. As for my daughter and I think I need to buy a weapon if we're going to camp alone like this again. On December 14, 2014, a teenage boy was wandering the woods along the back roads of Beaver County, Pennsylvania, about 30 feet from the nearest path. It was a quiet and seldom traveled area, with the nearest paved road nearly a mile away. This road cut through a residential area with only about a dozen homes, minimal traffic, and was known as a local shortcut to and from Route 989. The boy was lost in the peace and solitude of nature, completely unaware of the unsettling discovery that awaited him. He only noticed it because it looked out of place, even in the bleak and desolate winter landscape of Pennsylvania. Among the death and decay of the cold season, the thing before him carried an unmistakable air of morbidity. As he approached and saw what it was, the realization hit him like a cold shock. With tears in his eyes and his heart pounding in his chest, he turned and ran, screaming, back into the woods. What he had found that gray December day was a severed head. But this was no ordinary disembodied head of a recently murdered person. It had been embalmed, preserved. When the police arrived hours later, they found the head with its eyes closed, but the mouth wide open. They began an extensive search of the surrounding area, hoping to find the body it had once belonged to, but they found nothing. The head was remarkably well preserved, and its face was still clearly recognizable. However, despite their best efforts, forensic teams were unable to identify the owner. A facial reconstruction was done, but it still provided no clues. Forensic experts estimated that the head had been lying there for about a week to a month, just hidden among the fallen leaves, waiting to be found. Based on the gray hairs covering the scalp, they speculated the person was likely between 50 and 80 years old. An anatomy professor turned forensic artist, Michelle Vitale, was brought in by the local police department to study the head in detail. After hours of examining the remains, she came to a chilling conclusion. Whoever had severed the head had done so with remarkable precision. It was clear that the person who performed the dissection had some form of anatomical training, as the task had been completed with surgical skill. Her findings were strikingly reminiscent of the infamous 19th century serial killer, Jack the Ripper. When we lifted the skin flap at the nape of the neck, she explained in a harrowing interview with local news, we could see that the whole purpose of that incision was to access the key joint that would preserve both the head and the vertebral column. This wasn't somebody using a kitchen knife or anything like that. It was well done, and it was placed perfectly. She was dismembered professionally. Another piece of evidence that supported the theory that whoever had severed the head had done so with professional skill was the use of what are known as eye caps, a common mortician's tool. These are devices that reassemble contact lenses and are worn in a chillingly similar way. They slip between the eyeball and the eyelid of the deceased person and are complete with small ridges or spikes that maintain the natural curvature of the eye whilst holding the eyelids shut. The pathologist who examined the embalmed head removed these eye caps and found that the person's eyeballs had been removed, but also made a disturbing discovery. The eyeballs had been replaced with small red rubber bouncy balls, the kind a child might play with. Whoever had done such a thing obviously had a sick sense of humor and was undoubtedly a very dangerously disturbed individual. After the initial forensic analysis, the embalmed head was sent over to Salt Lake City-based ISO Forensics, who undertook isotope testing on it. For those unfamiliar with the technique, isotopes are particles that can be found in the human body that come from drinking water that can be traced back to a particular geographical location. When the results of the isotope testing came back, investigators were able to conclude that the woman had spent the previous several months being something of a nomad, having lived or at least stayed in areas including West Virginia, Western Maryland, Southern Pennsylvania, and even as far as Eastern Ohio and New York State. Yet, despite there being evidence to the owner of the severed head having lived in so many places, there was little to show that she had ever lived in Beaver County during time leading up to her death or discovered. However, the use of embalming fluid meant that determining the exact time of death was almost impossible. It also made DNA matching next to impossible, as the fluid destroyed nucleotide bonds that enabled such analysis to be undertaken. The small amount that was obtained was so damaged that it could not be matched to any other samples in the national database. But much to the relief of those involved with the analysis, it was discovered that there was no criminal element to her death, that the cardiac arrest was the most likely explanation for her demise. This was due to toxicology tests that had shown that there were trace amounts of lidocaine and atropine in her system, which are both varieties of medication that are used to treat irregular heart issues. Most likely a cardiac arrest, but not completely confirmed. One homicide detective was said to have been extremely skeptical that the owner of the embalmed head had died of natural causes, having seen far too many cases in which the possessiveness of the killer was displayed and their willingness to tamper and toy with the body of their quarry. When interviewed by journalists, Beaver County Coroner Terry Tadalovic Rossi said, "Could it have been someone with a great deal of anatomical knowledge? Yes. Could it have been someone who is just peculiar or bizarre? The answer to that question is also yes. We just don't know at this point." Michael O'Brien, the borough police chief, claimed the embalmed head was found so far off the road that it was entirely possible that it could have been simply thrown from a passing car. It was also determined that the scent and flavor of the embalming fluid would have made the flesh very unappealing to scavenger animals, so there was little chance it had been dropped by some hungry fox. The placement was deliberate. Someone had wanted it to be found sooner or later. A number of funeral homes that associated with the Pennsylvania Funeral Directors Association were contacted with pleas for information, and details of the bizarre case were even shared at a National Funeral Directors Association conference. But unsurprisingly, no one could shed any light of the gruesome situation. Every theory, with the exception of grave robbery, had been dismissed, with many agreeing that the most likely explanation is that the owner of the embalmed head had been a victim of the black market trade that deals in the illegal acquisition of human remains, either for professional or recreational purposes. There's a black market on body parts, and that market is pretty extensive, Beaver County District Attorney Anthony was reported to have said. Detectives have repeatedly stated that they believe the head may have been removed from the corpse of a natural cause death by what's known as a body broker, an individual or firm who purchases and sells cadavers or remains. One solid reason that this line of investigation is thought to be the most plausible is because the black market cadaver industry had been linked to similar abuses in the past. Due to the plethora of firms where you can purchase human remains, any attempt to discover where the severed head came from is, according to Professor Michel Vitali, extremely hard to track. If the owner of the severed head is to ever be identified, it would almost certainly require the assistance of a dentist. The forensic investigation into the severed head revealed even more unsettling details. The woman had extensive dental work done on every single tooth, with one of them being worked on as many as 7 times. Among the 3 teeth that had been extracted, forensic dentists discovered a filling compound that wasn't available to dental professionals before 2004. This indicated that the woman must have died after that year, but despite this clue, the dental analysis provided no further leads. However, Forensic investigators continue to hold on to hope that with a complete facial reconstruction, someone might eventually recognize her and bring closure to the case. Almost 6 years later, they still have no answers. We are no closer to discovering the identity of the woman whose head was found embalmed, nor do we know the identity of the sick individual responsible for severing her head or stealing it, only to replace her eyeballs with red rubber balls. The mystery of who placed the head in the woods of Pennsylvania may never be solved. But perhaps the more pressing question is whether we truly want to know the full story behind it. Would knowing the truth bring us closure, or would it make us wish we could stay in blissful ignorance, unable to sleep any easier knowing the dark secrets that lie beneath? When I was in college, I worked the night shift one summer vacation. I was 19 years old, an average-looking female, and honestly, I wasn't thrilled about having to work over the summer. But it was the only way I was going to be able to afford tuition. Working the night shift turned out to be one of the strangest experiences of my life. I worked at the McDonald's drive-thru. I still remember my first night on the job. A lady pulled up, talking loudly to someone while she waited for us to take her order. She sounded absolutely furious, screaming at the top of her lungs. It seemed like it was directed at someone in the back seat. Immediately, I assumed she was yelling at her children. As a psychology major, I tend to pick up on things like that. She ordered 3 Big Macs and 3 large Cokes. But then, when she pulled up to pay for her meal, I saw that she was completely alone. I was honestly a little startled. Why would this woman be ordering so much food and screaming in her car if she was by herself? Couldn't wrap my mind around it. Despite that, she was polite when she spoke to me. She paid for her food, thanked me, and even told me to have a good night as she drove off. She was the only customer we had in a 45-minute window, and after she left, I saw some of my coworkers laughing. I asked what was so funny, and one of them told me, "That's your first encounter with Schizo Susan." They explained that she regularly came through the drive-thru, ordering way too much food for one person, always yelling at someone in her car, but there was never anyone else in the car. They didn't actually know her name, so they just called her Schizo Susan. Apparently, she would sometimes be the only customer to come through at all during the night shift. I found it unnerving. I immediately started wondering what was going on with this woman. About a week went by, and every night she showed up as predicted. She would place her order, and in between speaking to me and picking up her food, she'd always be yelling at someone. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was going on. So I came up with a plan. I decided I would ask her who she was talking to, acting like I thought she was talking to me. I figured this was the best way to ask without sounding confrontational. I remember it being a Friday night when I decided I was finally going to do it. I had chickened out a few times before, but since I didn't work weekends, I thought I might as well try something new to end my shift for the week. Well, the night that I did it, I listened in to her screaming for a few more seconds than I normally did. You see, I can listen to what people are saying through the McDonald's speaker without them necessarily knowing that I'm listening. If I don't say anything, they would never know. I normally never did this because it's kind of frowned upon. I'm pretty sure there's some kind of rule against it. But I listened for maybe 20 or 30 seconds. I listened for long enough to know that she was yelling at someone named Darian. When she was in the middle of saying something, I interrupted her and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am. Were you speaking to me?" She just replied, "No." Crap, I thought to myself. I knew that I had to try something else. I asked her if Darian would be ordering with her, then she went silent. It wasn't an entire minute, but she didn't say anything. After the second time of asking her if she was still there, she let out a banshee scream. It was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. It really hurt my ears. The McDonald's microphone system is already pretty loud, but when someone screams into it, trust me when I say that it is the most unbearable thing you have ever experienced. I was also surprised at how long she screamed. She had one deep, loud, guttural scream going for like 30 entire seconds. In the moment, though, I was scared for my life. I also got really worried that I was going to lose my job. I felt really guilty for asking, like it was my fault for setting her off. In retrospect, I don't think I really did anything horrible to her. Literally just asked her if the person whose name she was screaming just a minute ago was also going to be ordering food. She didn't actually say anything when she screamed. It was just kind of a violent and guttural screaming. I was really taken aback there for a minute. How the heck do you even respond to that? I asked her if she wanted to continue placing her order, and that's when she just drove away. She really floored it and drove way faster than she should have. And as she drove by, I saw her face looking at me through the window. It must have been only a split second that I could see her, but I got that one really good look at her. She looked extremely distressed, and as if things couldn't get any weirder, the microphone system stopped working correctly the rest of the night. I think she screamed loud enough to break something in it. That was hands down the weirdest thing to ever happen to me throughout any jobs I've ever worked, and this weird lady just disappeared after that. She stopped coming to McDonald's altogether. I asked some of my other co-workers how long she had been stopping by for her nightly visits, and they all said that it was for as long as they can remember, which probably meant at least a year. I felt somewhat guilty for pissing this lady off so bad, but I think it is safe to say she probably needs some serious mental help. I haven't worked at McDonald's in a long time, and I don't ever plan on working fast food again. I just hope that wherever that lady ended up, she got the help that she so desperately and obviously needed. There's something about road trips that always gets me excited. The freedom of the open road, the thrill of adventure, and the feeling that anything could happen at any moment. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months. A long drive across the country with no set agenda, just a loose idea of visiting a few landmarks along the way. It was supposed to be one of those trips where you made memories, not necessarily stuck to a strict schedule. But looking back now, I wish we had planned more carefully that day. It was our third day on the road, cruising through the endless plains of the Midwest. The sun was starting to dip, casting an orange hue across the horizon, and we were all in high spirits. Music blared from the speakers, snacks were scattered across the back seat, and we had no worries in the world. That is, until Jason, who was driving, suggested a detour. "There's this old scenic road coming up," he said, glancing over his shoulder at us. "We'll get to check out some small towns and maybe even find a cool spot to camp for the night." I wasn't too sure about the idea. The GPS had us on a major highway, a direct route to the next town where we planned to grab dinner and find a motel. But Jason was determined to take the scenic route, and the rest of the group seemed excited by the idea. So, against my better judgment, we went along with it. That was mistake number one. The moment we turned off the highway onto that narrow two-lane road, something felt off. The pavement was cracked and uneven, and thick trees lined the sides of the road, seeming to loom over us like they were watching our every move. The sunlight filtered through the branches in long, eerie beams, and the air felt heavier, like we had entered a different world the moment we left the main highway. Still, no one said anything. We were too busy taking in how secluded it felt, like we had stumbled onto a forgotten path that hadn't seen a car in ages. About half an hour into the detour, I noticed the GPS signal had dropped. The little blue dot that had been tracking us was frozen in place, refusing to load. I mentioned it to Jason, but he waved it off. "It's probably just the trees messing with the signal," he said. "We'll hit an open area soon." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to be the one to spoil the mood, so I let it slide. The road kept winding through the trees, growing narrower with each passing mile. We hadn't seen another car since we turned off, and the farther we went, the more the feeling of isolation crept in. About an hour later, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and we were surrounded by nearly total darkness. The headlights barely cut through the thick shadows cast by the trees, and the atmosphere inside the car had shifted. The chatter had stopped, and everyone stared out the windows, searching for any sign of life, anything to indicate where we were. That's when we realized we had been driving in circles. "Wait, is that the same sign we passed an hour ago?" I asked, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. There, on the side of the road, was a rusted metal sign, half hidden by overgrown weeds. It looked familiar, too familiar. Jason slowed down, frowning. "No way. I've been following the road we couldn't have looped back. But deep down, we all knew we had. Somehow, we were right back where we started. That creeping sense of unease settled in my chest like a weight. And I glanced at my phone again. Still no signal. We were completely cut off. Maybe we should turn around. Sarah, my best friend, said from the back seat, her voice tight with worry. This doesn't feel right. Jason hesitated, but nodded. Yeah, I think you're right. We'll head back to the highway. He put the car in reverse, turned around, and started driving back the way we came. For the first few minutes, I felt a flicker of relief. We'd retrace our steps, get back on the highway, and laugh about how we'd gotten spooked for nothing. But as we drove, the road started to look different. The twists and turns were sharper, the trees denser, and the headlights seemed to barely penetrate the growing darkness. The road wasn't the same as when we had come in. That's when the panic started to set in. I swear this isn't the same way we came, I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Just keep driving, Sarah said, her voice shaky. We'll find our way back. But I could hear the doubt in her voice. We all felt it. The road kept twisting, stretching out farther into the night. And soon, the only sound in the car was the rhythmic of the tires on the cracked pavement. After what felt like hours, Jason slammed on the brakes. We skidded to a stop in the middle of the road, and I felt my heart jump into my throat. Up ahead, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights, was an old gas station. The sign out front flickered weakly, casting a pale light over the building, and a single rusty pump stood out front, covered in dust and cobwebs. We'll stop and ask for directions, Jason said, though his voice didn't sound confident. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be inside, but the place looked abandoned, had probably been abandoned for years. Still, we had no other options. We pulled up next to the pump, and Jason got out. I watched as he walked toward the gas station's front door, peering inside the dark windows. The rest of us stayed in the car, our eyes glued to the empty road behind us. Minutes passed, and Jason didn't come back. Where the hell is he? Sarah muttered, her hands gripping the seat in front of her. I don't know, I said, my throat dry. Maybe no one's here. Before we could decide what to do, the front door of the gas station creaked open, and Jason stepped out, his face pale. He climbed back into the car, not saying a word. What happened? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There's no one here, he said, staring straight ahead. The place is completely empty, but he trailed off, his eyes wide. But what? Sarah pressed, leaning forward. There's food inside. Fresh food, cans, snacks, even soda. But it looks like no one's touched the place in years. Like, someone's been stalking it, but no one's around. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't right. None of it was right. This wasn't right. None of it was right. Let's get out of here, I said, my voice trembling. We'll keep driving until we find the highway. Jason nodded, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. We pulled back onto the road, the gas station fading into the night behind us. But the feeling of dread only grew stronger as we drove on. The road stretched endlessly, winding through the dark forest like a snake, each curve taking us farther from civilization. Then suddenly we spotted headlights in the distance. My heart jumped. Another car. Finally, we weren't alone out here. But as it neared, something felt wrong. The lights were blinding, yet there was no sound, no engine, no tires on the pavement, nothing. Just those intense headlights rushing toward us. Faster and faster. Jason jerked the wheel, swerving to the side and pulling off the road just in time. The car sped past, its headlights vanishing into the distance as quickly as they had appeared. My heart hammered in my chest, and I turned around to look behind us. There was no car, no taillights, nothing. What the hell was that? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. We were too rattled, too confused. We kept driving, the silence in the car thick with fear. Each mile felt like we were sinking deeper into something we couldn't understand, something we couldn't escape. The road, the trees, the darkness, they all blurred together. Soon I lost all sense of time. Eventually, we saw the sign for the highway again. But by then, none of us felt relief. We had been driving in circles, sure, but this wasn't a normal detour. Something was wrong with that road, and we all felt it. We didn't stop until we reached the next town. Hours later, our nerves were frayed, and our hands were still shaking. When we finally pulled into the parking lot of a small motel, we sat there in silence, too stunned to speak. None of us mentioned what had happened that night. We didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to give it any more power than it already had. But even now, I think about it sometimes late at night when I'm alone, and I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't found our way out? There's something unsettling about truck stops in the dead of night. The harsh lights casting long, distorted shadows, the eerie stillness, and that strange feeling that time has somehow slowed down. I've been driving trucks for over a decade, and I've seen my fair share of strange occurrences on the road. But nothing, not even the countless desolate highways or the foggy mountain passes, could have prepared me for what happened that night. I'd been behind the wheel for nearly 14 hours straight, and the fatigue was starting to take its toll. My eyes were heavy, my hands felt stiff on the wheel, and the endless road in front of me seemed like it would stretch on forever. I knew I had to stop, get some rest, or at least grab a coffee to keep me going until my next drop-off. That's when I saw it. A truck stop glowing in the distance, its fluorescent lights cutting through the darkness like a lighthouse. It wasn't on my usual route, but when you're out in the middle of nowhere, you take what you can get. I signaled, slowed down, and steered my rig into the parking lot, the engine rumbling as I pulled to a stop near the edge. As I stepped out of the cab, the crisp night air hit me. But something about this place felt wrong. It was too quiet. There were a few trucks parked around, likely with drivers sleeping in their cabs, but there wasn't a single person walking around. The gas pumps stood untouched, and the convenience store was dimly lit, with no sign of life inside. The only sound was the soft hiss of my truck cooling down. I tried to brush off the unease. I'd been on the road too long. That's all it was. My mind was playing tricks. I needed to stretch my legs, grab a coffee, and maybe catch a couple hours of sleep before getting back on the road. I headed toward the convenience store, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead as I passed through the automatic doors. The place was empty, just like I expected, and the cold air inside hit me like a wall. There was a cashier behind the counter, but he didn't acknowledge me. He was hunched over, his face hidden beneath a baseball cap, and his hands were clasped together on the counter, as if lost in thought. "Evening," I mumbled as I walked toward the coffee machine. No response. The coffee machine sputtered, dispensing the last drops into my cup. Great, lukewarm, stale coffee. I took a sip and winced. Still, it was better than nothing. I grabbed a pack of gum and a bottle of water from the shelf, then headed back to the counter. The cashier didn't move. He didn't even seem to notice I was there. I placed my items down, waiting for him to ring them up, but the silence stretched on. "Hey, man," I called out, louder this time, a hint of frustration in my voice. "You okay?" That's when he finally stirred. Slowly, his head tilted up just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His eyes, there was something off about them. They were dull, almost lifeless, like he wasn't fully there. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a moment before his hands moved in a stiff robotic motion, scanning my items. The uneasy feeling from earlier came rushing back. Stronger now. I suddenly wanted to get out of there, get back to my truck, and put as much distance between me and this place as possible. I shoved a few bills onto the counter and grabbed my things, not even bothering to wait for my change. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint sound behind me, a low, distorted, almost like static. I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see the cashier fiddling with a radio or something, but he was just standing there completely still, his hands resting on the counter, his head slightly tilted to one side. The static sound grew louder, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I hurried out of the store, my heart pounding, and made my way back to my truck. The parking lot felt even more deserted than before, the lights casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move as I walked. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I turned the engine on, hoping the familiar rumble would calm my nerves. Didn't. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. The convenience store was still there, glowing under the harsh lights, but something caught my eye. Near the edge of the lot, just at the edge of the shadows, there was a figure standing there. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a person, just standing there, perfectly still, facing my direction. A chill ran down my spine. I pressed down on the gas, eager to get back on the road, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, until the store in the lot disappeared from my view entirely. I told myself I was overreacting. I was tired, running on fumes, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the miles ticked by, the feeling of dread didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. The next few hours were a blur. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, the occasional sign whizzing past in the headlights. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that I wasn't alone. At some point, I decided to pull off to the side of the road to catch some sleep. I parked at a rest area, a small quiet spot with a few benches and a vending machine. There were no other vehicles around, but that didn't surprise me. It was the middle of the night after all. I turned off the engine, settled back in the driver's seat, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come. It started as a faint tapping, just a light, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere outside the cab. I opened my eyes, my heart immediately speeding up. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, scanning the surroundings. But there was nothing. The road was deserted, the rest stop eerily quiet. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the truck. But the tapping persisted, soft, yet deliberate, like someone was knocking on the door. I grabbed my flashlight, pausing for a moment before rolling down the window just a crack. I shined the light outside, sweeping it across the parking lot, the road, and the trees that surrounded me. Nothing. I rolled the window back up, my hands shaking, and locked the doors once again. But the tapping didn't stop. Now it was coming from the passenger side, as if someone, or something, was moving around the truck, knocking on the windows. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. The tapping ceased. The silence that followed felt worse. I sat there, my breath ragged, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes dragged on, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the engine cooling down. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even move. I stayed seated, wide awake, until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, finally giving me the courage to step outside and inspect the truck. There was nothing there. No footprints, no signs that anyone or anything had come near. But as I climbed back into the cab, something made my blood run cold. On the passenger side window, smeared in the dust, was a single handprint. I never stopped at that truck stop again. In fact, I've gone out of my way to avoid that entire stretch of highway ever since. Whatever happened that night, whatever I heard, whatever was out there, I don't want to know. And the next time I'm driving late at night and feel that unsettling sense of dread creeping in, I'll listen to it. Because when you're out on the open road, in the middle of nowhere, sometimes your instincts are the only thing that can keep you safe.